Welcome to The Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. In a world just awash with information, our mission is really to cut through the noise, extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, and, well, serve them up with surprising facts and just enough humor to keep you hooked. Today, we're taking a deep dive into some truly revolutionary material. Stuff that promises to reshape our understanding of how we live longer and, importantly, healthier lives.
Indeed, we're pulling from quite a rich stack of sources today, including some really insightful excerpts from Super Agers, an evidence-based approach to longevity by Topol. This deep dive is custom-tailored for you, our curious listener, to help you really grasp what's most important in this groundbreaking field.
Yeah, and our mission today is to unpack the latest insights into extending human health span, that crucial period of life where you're free from chronic disease and disability. We're going to explore how breakthroughs in life science and information technology are converging. It really puts us in an enviable position to truly reset our health span expectations. This isn't just about adding years to life, is it? It's about adding life to years.
Exactly. We'll be navigating through some fascinating territory, everything from the microscopic world of our cells right up to the broad strokes of lifestyle and environment. And then we'll get into the cutting-edge stuff, drugs and vaccines. Each chapter, really each concept we explore today, offers entirely new perspectives on how we can manipulate, maybe even rebuild our own health.
Okay, let's unpack this. What's really driving this multidimensional revolution in health span right now? It feels like something big is shifting. The foundational shift, understanding our cells and data. So what's truly powering this revolution? It does feel like a moment that's been decades in the making, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. We're witnessing a remarkable convergence. Breakthroughs that have been building for years. We're talking, more than 20 years since we sequenced the human genome, a decade since CRISPR gene editing was discovered, 30 years of mRNA and nanoparticle development work, and, many decades for large language AI models to really mature. Cumulatively, it represents hundreds of years of dogged perseverance that has put us in this remarkable position. It's not just one thing, it's everything happening together.
And this isn't just theoretical research locked away in labs. This is about very practical applications that are, changing lives now, correct?
Exactly. This new understanding lets us fundamentally reset our human health span expectations. We can significantly expand the healthy period of our lives. And this power comes from 5 key interacting dimensions. Think of them as pillars: our lifestyle choices, the complex world of our microbiome, the inner workings of our cells, our genomics blueprint, and then the rapid advancements in new drugs and vaccines. They all interact, you see. Your lifestyle directly influences your microbiome and your cells, how your body responds to a new drug or vaccine. That's profoundly modulated by your unique genomics and cells. And crucially, discovering entirely new drugs is, tremendously enhanced by understanding specific gene variants and, of course, the accelerating power of AI.
So let's dive into that cells dimension you mentioned. The materials suggest our understanding of the, nearly 37 trillion cells in our body offers an entirely new range of insights. What's the truly revolutionary insight here?
Yeah, 37 trillion. It's mind-boggling. The truly revolutionary insight is this. We're no longer just observing cells. We're now actively learning how to re-engineer these fundamental building blocks of life. Each week, honestly, researchers are publishing new work involving molecular sequencing. They're determining the genetic material of hundreds of thousands, even millions, of single cells. This lets us understand their intricate workings across time and space, revealing pathways we never saw before. But more importantly, it shows us precisely how we can manipulate and even rebuild them. This changes everything for how we approach disease. We're moving beyond just treating symptoms to fundamentally altering the cellular landscape of health itself.
Can you give us an example? How is this manipulation being applied right now? How do these tiny components actually become powerful therapies?
Okay, a prime example is T cells. These are vital immune cells. We can actually take them out of a person's body and then engineer them. For instance, in cancer treatment, they can be substantially revved up, boosting the immune response to fight tumors. Or, conversely, for autoimmune conditions, these same T cells can be engineered to suppress an immune response that's mistakenly attacking the body's own tissues. And we're already seeing this process become faster and cheaper, which makes these advanced therapies more accessible. This engineering of our cells literally turns them into living drugs. It's a powerful, targeted therapy derived from our own biology.
Wow. Speaking of cells, I found this surprising fact in the material about fat cells, adipocytes. They're a tiny fraction of our total cell count, but they make up a dominant part of our cell biomass, mostly white fat tissue. That's quite a vivid illustration of their disproportionate presence, right? Underscores their metabolic importance despite their numbers.
That's a great point. And these kinds of insights, along with many others, are only possible because of the critical role of large-scale data. The UK Biobank study, for instance, it's mentioned many times in this material for a reason. It's an incredible resource. We're talking 500 to 2,000 participants. They have their genome sequence, electronic health records, medical scans, and now we're approaching 20 years of extended follow-up. This kind of longitudinal data has yielded seminal new insights for promoting health span. It gives us unprecedented views into the drivers of health and disease over a lifetime.
That sounds incredibly powerful, like a real goldmine of information. But are there limitations, any drawbacks to such a large study we should be aware of?
Yes, there's a crucial point here, which the source material explicitly highlights. The UK Biobank, well, it's not a very diverse population. Something like 94% of participants are of white ethnicity. So this limitation really underscores the urgent need for multi-ancestry resources. We need to make sure the insights gained are truly applicable to everyone globally. The All of Us initiative in the United States, it's actually the largest investment for a medical research program in U.S. history, is actively addressing this. They're pulling together exactly that kind of diverse data. It's just essential for insights to be truly universal and benefit all populations, not just a select few. The everyday battleground, diet and environmental toxins.
Okay, so we've talked about these foundational breakthroughs, the sheer scale of scientific progress in understanding our biology. But how does this translate to the everyday choices we make? Let's turn our attention to what many consider the front line of health, our diet and the environment around us. Now, when we talk about lifestyle, especially things like diet, exercise, sleep, the source material points out that the studies are predominantly observational from large groups. Why is that?
Right. Well, it's extremely difficult, maybe even impossible, to randomly assign a lifestyle to a person and expect them to stick with it for many years. Imagine trying to enforce a specific diet or exercise regimen for decades in a controlled trial. It's just not practical or ethical, really. So instead, researchers observe real-life statistics. They look at large groups of people living their normal lives rather than conducting contrived experimental studies. The challenge, though, the big caveat, is that these large real-life cohorts often rely on, imprecise data. Things like food diaries or people trying to remember what they ate. This can definitely introduce biases and inaccuracies that researchers need to account for.
So these studies can only show an association, right? Not a definitive cause and effect relationship. How should we interpret them then? What's the takeaway?
Precisely. They illuminate an association when you see a consistent pattern of benefit or harm across multiple different reports. While they don't establish causation directly, they're still incredibly meaningful, especially when looking at something broad like all-cause mortality, meaning it doesn't matter what a person died of. If a lifestyle factor consistently links to higher death rates overall, that suggests there are real negative health effects happening, maybe through pathways we haven't even discovered yet. Now, for causal relationships, you need smaller, more limited randomized trials. And when we do have those, they deserve extra credence. But this raises an important question, doesn't it? How do we act on associations that are strongly suggested but not causally proven, especially when they involve common things like diet? It really requires a balance of informed caution and practical application.
Okay, let's talk about food, specifically ultra-processed foods, UPFs. The source describes them pretty strikingly as like UFOs. They're alien, industrially produced, unnatural substances. They're not even food. What makes them so problematic for our health span?
Yeah, that's a strong quote, but it captures the essence.
Yeah.
The core issue is that these UPFs are just not something you'd find in a standard home kitchen. They're composed of ingredients and processes far removed from natural food preparation. There are two major dimensions of damage here, chemical and physical. First, the chemical side. They contain this long list of artificial additives and industrially modified ingredients, things like artificial sweeteners, hydrogenated oils, various emulsifiers, processed proteins, or starches you wouldn't cook with at home. The advice is pretty clear. You should really try to limit or avoid these as much as possible.
And the physical changes, the way they're manufactured.
Right, that's the second dimension. Their manufacture involves significant physical changes in texture and form. Things like molding, extrusion, pre-frying. These processes are designed to maximize digestibility and accelerate absorption in your digestive tract. This leads to those rapid spikes in blood glucose and insulin, the exact opposite of what something like dietary fiber does, which slows digestion and reduces those spikes. Think of breakfast cereals or many snack bars. They're often extruded at high temperatures, melting and molding ingredients into forms that just break down incredibly quickly in your body, fundamentally altering the food matrix. And the source even points out another layer of contaminants like bisphenols, mineral oils, phthalates can leach from the packaging into these foods. That adds another concern not even captured by common food classification systems.
So what are the actual health consequences of eating these alien foods? What's the bottom line for our listeners?
Well, UPFs are associated with a really wide array of serious health issues: fatty liver disease, most types of cancer, sleep disorders, inflammatory bowel disease, depression, even dementia. And here's a truly alarming statistic from a huge review of 45 studies. A 62% increase in all-cause mortality linked to consuming more than 4 servings per day of UPF. 62%, that's huge. And for a direct causal link, there was a randomized trial by Kevin Hall and his colleagues, published in Cell Metabolism back in 2019. It showed participants on an ultra-processed food diet actually gained weight, while those on an unprocessed diet lost weight, even when calories and macros were matched. The takeaway is stark. Reducing UPFs is likely one of the most impactful dietary changes you can make for your overall health and longevity.
Okay, switching gears slightly. The story of artificial sweeteners seems a bit more complicated, you said, with conflicting reports out there. What should we really know about them?
You're right. The picture is quite complex and honestly a bit confusing. A comprehensive review of available data, looking at both randomized and observational studies, actually found a lack of compelling evidence for associated risk with these non-nutritive artificial sweeteners. However, in stark contrast, another large cohort study over 100,000 people found a direct association between consuming certain sweeteners, particularly aspartame, ethyl potassium, and sucralose, and increased risk of cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease. So this is where it gets really interesting because the findings aren't always consistent. It makes drawing a definitive universal conclusion quite challenging.
So what did the randomized trials show specifically? What was the direct impact on the body in those controlled settings?
Okay, there was a randomized trial with 120 healthy adults. They were given either saccharin, sucralose, aspartame, stevia, or a control for 2 weeks. It found that the first two, saccharin and sucralose, actually induced impaired glucose regulation. They messed with how the body handled sugar. All 4 sweeteners tested were associated with changes in the oral and gut microbiome. And we know from previous work that altering the gut microbiome is tied to abnormal glycemic responses. So overall, the data for artificial sweeteners seems unfavorable, suggesting caution is definitely warranted. But the source does note it's probably not nearly as worrisome as consuming high amounts of actual sugar. Stevia specifically appeared to be less concerning than the others in that trial. The takeaway: while maybe better than pure sugar, they aren't exactly a free pass. Your body still reacts to them.
Okay, let's talk salt. The link between sodium intake and hypertension, high blood pressure seems pretty clear. But the material says the magnitude of the effect is debated. How significant is it for the average person?
Yeah, while the link itself is clear, the size of the effect is where the debate lies. A large Cochrane Library review, looking at 195 intervention studies, concluded the effect of restricting sodium was actually quite small. On average, it led to a decrease in mean blood pressure of only 0.4 mmHg, though, interestingly, it was slightly greater among Black and Asian participants. So in clinical practice, reducing dietary sodium can help some people, but the impact really varies considerably among individuals. And extensive analysis suggested moderate consumption, like 1 to 2 teaspoons of salt per day, which is about 2 grams of sodium, wasn't really a problem. However, increased cardiovascular risk became obvious at levels over 5 grams of sodium per day. And just for context, the average American intake is around 3.5 grams per day. That's considerably higher than the recommendations from groups like the American Heart Association or the World Health Organization, which are usually between 1.5 and 2.25 grams.
And is it only about blood pressure when it comes to salt? Or are there broader risks we should think about?
No, definitely not just blood pressure. The risks aren't confined to that. Multiple experimental studies, mostly in models, support the idea that a high-salt diet actually reduces blood flow to the brain. It seems to do this through dysfunction of the blood vessel walls, carrying a potential risk of cognitive impairment down the line. Other studies have also backed up the finding that people who consume the least amount of sodium generally have the lowest risk of cardiovascular disease. So the best general advice seems to be, Avoid or limit adding salt to your food. Pay close attention to food labels. Sodium hides in a lot of processed foods, and maybe consider potassium chloride salt substitutes, but only if you don't have kidney disease. It's really about overall dietary balance.
We hear so much about fat in our diet. What's the latest understanding here? Are we moving beyond those simple fat is bad messages?
Oh, absolutely. The understanding of dietary fat has evolved significantly. The emphasis now is much more on quality over just quantity. There's even, get this, a dedicated gut-brain reward circuit, specifically for fat intake. It's conveyed through the vagus nerve, and it actually synergizes with the sugar reward circuit to promote dopamine release and, potentially, overeating. And interestingly, single-cell studies found that silencing the specific neurons involved in this circuit actually abolished the preference for fat intake in animal models. It shows a precise mechanism for how our bodies are wired to seek fat. So what's really fascinating here is the growing realization that the subtype of each macronutrient, whether it's carbs, protein, or fat, truly matters. It shifts the focus from simply restricting fat to understanding its quality and where it comes from.
Right, like with dairy products, they're a source of saturated fat, but the guidance telling us to choose low-fat milk and yogurt dates back to, 1980? And it hasn't really been updated. That seems like a long time for potentially outdated advice.
That's exactly right. And a big 2018 report looking at over 130,000 people from 21 countries followed for 9 years, found something quite different. It found that consuming 2 or more servings of dairy daily, not necessarily low fat, was actually associated with 22% less cardiovascular disease and 17% less all-cause mortality. This really challenges some of that conventional wisdom that just demonized all saturated fats, suggesting a much more nuanced view is needed. The quality and the context of fat within a food matrix are clearly more important than just the label saturated.
So the quality of fat is truly more important than just the amount. That seems to be the recurring theme.
Yes, exactly. The relationship to all-cause mortality, shown in studies following over 125,000 adults for up to 32 years, is pretty clear. A shift away from saturated fats towards unsaturated mono or polyunsaturated fats is consistently accompanied by more favorable longevity data. Specifically, shifting from saturated fats to plant-based unsaturated fats was associated with a substantial reduction in the risk of both cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes in 4 separate clinical trials. There was an influential paper in Science magazine titled Dietary Fat, From Foe to Friend by David Ludwig and colleagues. Their conclusion: the answer depends on the quality of the fat, not so much the overall content level. It's a really powerful shift in understanding.
What about popular diets like the ketogenic diet that relies so heavily on fat intake? How does that fit into this picture?
The keto diet. Typically very high fat, maybe 76% of calories, very low carbs, less than 10%, and moderate protein. It's been hugely popular for weight loss. However, it's also associated with some downsides. Higher cholesterol and potential cardiovascular risk, brain fog, that flu-like illness people call keto flu, and it can even promote fatty liver disease. There was a randomized trial at the NIH Clinical Center that compared a ketogenic diet, mostly animal-based, with a plant-based low-fat diet. Interestingly, despite having less impact on blood sugar, the ketogenic diet group ended up eating about 700 calories more per day over 2 weeks. So the low-fat diet group actually lost more weight in that trial. And here's where it gets really interesting, maybe even a bit unnerving. A fascinating study in mice showed that mitochondrial dysfunction induced by a high-fat diet was actually transmitted via sperm to male offspring. That's a particularly concerning finding, suggesting potential long-term, even intergenerational impacts of very high-fat diets that we need to consider.
Okay, let's shift to fasting and calorie restriction. They've gained a lot of attention for health benefits. What does the actual evidence say about their impact on health span?
Well, looking at basic calorie restriction, or just continuous eating with fewer calories, the data suggests only modest improvement in glucose regulation. Many small trials of intermittent fasting, things like alternate day fasting or doing it 2 days a week, have shown parallel benefits for metabolic markers. A systematic analysis published in 2024 echoed this. However, the source is clear. General conclusions about these results remain elusive. The long-term, large-scale randomized data in humans just isn't there yet to make definitive claims. Crucially, no calorie-restricted, time-restricted, or intermittent fasting diets have been proven to provide significant anti-aging properties in humans over sustained periods.
So what are the downsides, and what's the practical takeaway for listeners, given those elusive conclusions?
Strict calorie-restricted diets are notoriously hard to adhere to long-term. They've also been associated with loss of bone density and muscle mass, and even slowed brain function. Remember, our brain is only 2% of our body mass, but uses about 20% of our calorie intake. On the other hand, multiple studies do support an improved immune response with caloric restriction, and perhaps relatedly, potential anti-tumor effects show up in experimental models. So, while the big anti-aging proof isn't there yet, a small randomized trial did show a reduction in a biological age score based on biomarker improvements, with multiple cycles of a fasting mimicking diet. Therefore, perhaps the best practical advice, until more definitive evidence emerges, is simply to try eating an early dinner, maybe at least 3 to 4 hours before going to bed, and avoid any caloric intake before the next morning's breakfast. This simple shift, this time-restricted eating window, might offer surprising benefits for your metabolic health, even without resorting to extreme restriction.
Okay, beyond diet, exercise is clearly fundamental. What are the key takeaways from the sources about its undeniable impact on health span?
Yeah, the evidence here is just incredibly strong and pervasive. Exercise is truly one of the most powerful prescriptions we have for extending health span. Just look at this. Compared with no exercise, simply briskly walking 450 minutes per week, that's about an hour a day, 6 days a week was associated with living 4.5 years longer. That powerful evidence comes from a huge cohort. Over 650,000 individuals followed for more than a decade. Very robust real-world data. And the benefits extend across the board. A multitude of associated benefits are seen for all major organ systems. Significant reductions in cardiovascular mortality, cancer mortality, and overall all-cause mortality. A systematic review of almost 200 studies covering over 30 million participants reported a link to a 31% reduction in all-cause mortality. And there was a clear dose response, meaning more activity consistently leads to more benefit. You get out what you put in, basically. A similar magnitude of benefit was even seen for improved sleep in a study following 4,000 participants for 10 years.
What about that popular 10,000 steps goal? Is that still the gold standard, or has the science refined that number?
Yeah, the science has definitely refined it. For older individuals, say mean age around 72, a reduction in all-cause mortality was seen starting at just 2,700 steps per day. And the magnitude of benefit increased up to a plateau around 7,500 steps per day. So you don't necessarily need 10,000 for significant benefits in that age group. Another systematic analysis of 12 studies with over 110,000 people found the benefit started even earlier, around 2,500 steps per day. That gave an 8% reduction in all-cause mortality. And it progressively increased up to 8,800 steps per day, which led to a remarkable 60% reduction in all-cause mortality and cardiovascular events. Interestingly, there was even additional benefit noted for how many steps were taken per minute, the intensity irrespective of the total step count. And coincidentally, that much ballyhooed 10,000-step goal, which was initially advanced without much empirical evidence, actually was supported by a large UK biobank study. It found the lowest mortality risk occurred between 9,000 and 10,500 steps per day. Faster walking speeds also offered more protection from developing type 2 diabetes, so intensity matters too.
So, steps are a good proxy for general activity, but what about structured exercise? What often gets missed in that conversation?
Right. The problem with using steps alone is it doesn't fully capture discrete exercise time. That non-work effort where you get a sustained increase in heart rate to promote aerobic cardiovascular fitness. The recommendation of 150 minutes per week of moderate physical activity is meant to consist of dedicated sessions, not just the steps you take getting around during the day. And this is where, as the source mentions, my own experience as a cardiologist comes in. For decades, I really only stressed the need for aerobic exercise. I completely omitted the importance of strength, resistance, and balance training. That was a mistake, especially with all the recent evidence highlighting the loss of muscle mass as we age, sarcopenia, and how important muscle mass is for prognosis. So aerobic conditioning should really be considered just one of the two requisite dimensions of exercise. You need strength too. This strength activity can include things like push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, squats, lunges, or using weights, bands, or machines. Ideally, you want to target all the major muscle groups: arms, chest, abdomen, legs, hips, back.
Okay. Are there any specific targets or examples for strength training that listeners can aim for? Something concrete?
Well, one way to gauge muscle power is the sit-to-stand test, how many times you can stand up from a chair in 30 seconds. A good goal for women and men over 65 is around 11 to 12 times. You can work towards that goal with basic movements like squats, hinges like deadlifts, and pushes like push-ups or presses. Maybe adding light weights, starting with just 5-pound dumbbells. And here's where it gets really interesting, something people might not expect. Isometric exercises. These involve holding tension in the body, like doing a wall squat. Holding that for maybe 8 minutes a day, 3 times a week, that kind of isometric work can lower blood pressure just as effectively as aerobic exercise or even high-intensity interval workouts. That's according to a review of 270 randomized trials. And unlike aerobic activity, where more is often better, studies looking at resistance training and all-cause mortality suggest that about 60 minutes per week might represent a plateau for benefit. You might get most of the longevity benefits within that hour.
Okay, let's turn to the environment. This section highlights how health dangers from air pollution and other environmental toxins have recently become far more obvious. Just how significant is this invisible threat to our health span?
It's extremely significant and frankly often underestimated in public health discussions. The Institute for Health Metrics actually concluded that particulate matter air pollution was the leading contributor to the global disease burden. That's a huge statement. Even short-term exposure to inhalable particulate matter, PM10, and especially the fine particulate matter, PM2.5, is associated with increased all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, and respiratory mortality. About 1 million deaths globally per year are thought to be attributable just to short-term exposure to fine particulate matter. And there's a steep slope of increased risk, even at very low exposure levels. Worryingly, no safe threshold has been identified for the chronic effect of PM2.5 on cardiovascular health. It's estimated that maybe 20% of type 2 diabetes cases are related to chronic exposure to fine particulate matter, showing its profound systemic impact. And perhaps most alarmingly, these risks for PM2.5, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone have been documented to exist even at levels that are below current national air quality standards. Our current regulations just aren't fully protective.
Wow, and what about other common toxins we're exposed to every day, like pesticides or those forever chemicals?
Right. Pesticides have been associated, though the evidence isn't always definitive due to lack of rigorous human studies, with the risk of multiple cancers, type 2 diabetes, cognitive impairment, Parkinson's disease, autoimmune diseases, thyroid issues, infertility, even loss of smell. The source suggests health risk could be significantly reduced by banning certain implicated chemicals like organophosphates and carbamates, but often regulatory action hasn't been taken. Then you have the ubiquitous PFAS chemicals, the forever chemicals and microplastics. Of the more than 10,000 PFAS chemicals out there, the EPA announced its first ever drinking water standard in 2024, but it only regulates 6 of them. Clearly, like with microplastics, we have a long, long way to go. These microplastics and nanoplastics, we inhale them, we ingest them, they can circulate in our bloodstream. They've recently been found in our brains, and they seem to have an alarming capacity to incite inflammation there. There's also concern about various metals, cadmium, tungsten, uranium, cobalt, copper, zinc, and their relationship to cardiovascular disease. One prospective study found a marked increase in cardiovascular events and all-cause mortality proportional to elevated levels of these metals in urine.
So what does this all mean for us? It really highlights how many environmental factors we're just constantly exposed to that can chip away at our long-term health span.
It's a complex web, isn't it?
Breakthroughs in disease management.
Okay, shifting from those specific exposures, let's look at the cumulative power of a healthy lifestyle. The material mentions a fascinating study on U.S. veterans. What was the key finding there?
Yes, that was a really striking study. It looked at more than 700,000 U.S. veterans. It showed that the cumulative effect of adhering to 8 healthy lifestyle factors, never smoking, being physically active, no excessive alcohol, getting restorative sleep, good nutrition, managing stress, having social connections, and no opioid disorder was associated with a massive increase in life expectancy at age 40. We're talking 24 years of added life expectancy for males and about 20.5 years for females. This isn't just a slight bump, it's a profound extension of life years attributed directly to these holistic lifestyle choices. And a lifestyle score based on those same factors was also associated with an increased likelihood of becoming a centenarian, living to 100. And it can even mitigate genetic risks. That feels incredibly empowering, the idea that lifestyle can override some genetic predispositions.
Absolutely. This is one of the most hopeful messages. A prospective study found that a healthy lifestyle was associated with marked improvement in healthy aging, offering about 8 to 10 extra years free from cancer, cardiovascular disease, or type 2 diabetes for people starting at age 50. And a favorable lifestyle was also linked to a lower risk of dementia across the entire spectrum of genetic risk, from low to high. It provides protection even if you have a genetic predisposition. This capacity for lifestyle to mitigate genetic predisposition, often calculated using what's called a polygenic risk score, like your genetic forecast for disease, was highlighted again in that UK Biobank study. Over a 13-year follow-up, a healthy lifestyle showed a favorable impact for over 40 different diseases, regardless of genetic risk. Which, again, raises that important question. If these benefits are so incredibly clear, and we've known about many of them for a while, why do you think it's still so hard for so many people to consistently implement them?
That is the critical question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, let's shift to a true game changer in disease management. GLP-1 drugs, they've really taken the world by storm for weight loss. The material frames this within a significant shift in how we even view obesity.
Yes. Historically, obesity was heavily stigmatized. It was often attributed simply to a lack of willpower, which we now know is a deeply flawed and harmful perspective. But in 2020, a joint international consensus statement called for ending this stigma, explicitly recognizing obesity as a complex chronic disease, one influenced by genetics, the gut microbiome, the environment, and various physiological and socioeconomic factors. This is a crucial shift in medical understanding. And related to that complexity, we've recently learned that the response to these GLP-1 drugs can be quite variable. Genetic variations in the GLP-1 receptor itself have been discovered that help explain why some people respond dramatically and others don't. In fact, over 10% of people who take these drugs for more than a year lose less than 5% of their body weight. And there's now actually a genetic test available that can help predict how well these drugs might work for an individual, paving the way for more personalized treatment approaches.
So what makes these drugs so revolutionary? Why are they seen as such a monumental achievement?
Well, simply put, we have never seen a class of drugs capable of inducing this magnitude of weight loss before. Never. That alone would be considered a monumental achievement, completely transforming the treatment landscape for obesity. But the impact these drugs are having on heart disease, kidney disease, and liver disease actually goes beyond just the weight loss achievement. For semaglutide, for instance, a 2021 trial showed an average loss of 15% of body weight. That's about 34 pounds for the average participant by escalating the dose. Then came tirzepatide, a newer molecule, which actually exceeded semaglutide's weight loss, inducing over 20% body weight loss at higher doses. It's a dual receptor agonist, hitting both GLP-1 and GIP receptors. And there are even newer ones being developed, like retatrutide, which is a triple receptor activator. What's also quite surprising about this drug class is a rare dissociation between side effects and efficacy. Usually those two things track together. More benefit often means more side effects, but that's not always the case here.
How do these drugs actually work in the body? What are the mechanisms behind these profound effects?
Well, while we probably don't fully understand all the intricate details yet, parts of the mechanism are becoming clear. Even before you take a bite of food, these drugs can induce a sense of fullness. It's termed pre-ingestion satiation, and it seems to be mediated by neurons in the hypothalamus, a key appetite control center in the brain. They also lower body weight by slowing down stomach emptying. This provides a physical sense of fullness from stomach stretching, which signals the vagus nerves, relaying that I'm full information back to the brain. The drugs can also induce nausea in some people, which naturally reduces appetite too. They communicate extensively with the brainstem and hypothalamus via the gut-brain axis, activating neural circuits that regulate not just appetite but also reward pathways. This modulation of the brain's limbic system seems to dull cravings and can even suppress addiction to things beyond food, including alcohol, tobacco, maybe even gambling. We also see a noted shift in food choices. People tend to choose less candy and snack foods, more vegetables and fish. And because they help the pancreas secrete more insulin and make muscles, fat tissue, and the liver less resistant to insulin, they improve glucose control and help fend off metabolic syndrome. It's a multi-pronged effect.
And beyond the weight loss, what about the cardiovascular benefits? Those seem equally, if not more, significant.
Oh, this is truly a monumental achievement, possibly overshadowing the weight loss itself in the long run. There was a large randomized trial, the SELECT trial, involving over 17,600 people. These were people with a high BMI and a history of heart disease, but without diabetes. They were treated with a semaglutide or a placebo for about 3 years. The result, a 20% relative reduction, which translated to a 1.5% absolute reduction in major adverse cardiovascular events, heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular deaths. And notably, there was a substantial reduction in inflammation, measured by the biomarker high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, hsCRP. And this reduction in inflammation happened before significant weight loss occurred. This really emphasizes that the GLP-1 drug's effect on reducing inflammation seems to proceed and be independent of the weight loss itself, revealing a direct protective mechanism for the cardiovascular system.
Okay, but are there any significant drawbacks or concerns with these drugs that listeners really need to be aware of? It can't all be positive, can it?
No, you're right. There are several important considerations and potential downsides. There are concerns about loss of bone density with these drugs. although some trials suggest this might be primarily due to the weight loss and reduced mechanical loading, not a direct effect of the drug itself. Exercise is likely key here. However, probably the biggest drawback is the potential need for a lifetime commitment. They seem to be forever drugs. Most people actually stop taking them within the first year, often due to side effects or cost. And randomized trials clearly show that stopping leads to significant weight regain. There's currently no manufacturer-identified exit strategy. Now, injections will likely be replaced by pills soon, making administration easier, but it still looks like lifelong therapy for sustained benefit. There are also unknowns about potential long-term side effects at the high doses used for obesity, as the longest follow-up specifically for obesity is only about 4 years right now. And if sarcopenic obesity, the loss of muscle mass along with fat loss, becomes a widespread issue, we could see an increase in the number of frail people with a higher risk of falls. That needs careful monitoring. And finally, the cost. It's high, around $13-30 per month in the U.S. without good insurance coverage. Coupled with the potential lifelong duration, this means the people who could benefit most often, individuals from minority groups or lower socioeconomic status who have higher rates of obesity and related diseases, may be the least likely to access or afford these drugs. This raises a really important question about equity and access as these transformative medications become more common. And this whole conversation about GLP-1s also connects directly back to type 2 diabetes, which, as the source material rightly notes, is arguably even worse than obesity in terms of its long-term health implications and the systemic damage it causes.
Right. So how does diet factor into type 2 diabetes management and prevention specifically? What's the best advice there?
Diet is absolutely a key factor, both for promoting and reducing inflammation, which is central to diabetes. For type 2 diabetes specifically, the benefit of low-carbohydrate diets has been amply validated. A systematic review looking at 23 different trials indicated a 32% increase in the remission of diabetes with these low-carb dietary approaches. Remission, that's huge. Interestingly, there's even a finding linking milk intake in people with lactose intolerance, identified by a specific gene variant to favorable changes in the gut microbiome and a lower risk of type 2 diabetes. It shows these complex interactions. And the relationship between your genetic predisposition for type 2 diabetes, that polygenic risk score again, and how that risk can be significantly reduced by following a healthy diet has also been established in multiple large cohort studies. It really demonstrates how powerfully lifestyle can interact with our genes.
And can we identify those at high risk for type 2 diabetes proactively? Can we get ahead of it?
Absolutely. We're getting much better at that. The Mass General Brigham Health System in Boston, for example, has started implementing these polygenic risk scores in their patient population. Looking at over 36,000 diverse participants, they found that about 8.4% fit into a high-risk category for type 2 diabetes, with nearly double the risk compared to average for those of European ancestry. And it's not just genes. Certain blood proteins can actually predict risk even better than a polygenic risk score or the standard hemoglobin A1C test. This kind of informative data about high risk should really be made available to everyone because there are so many effective ways to prevent type 2 diabetes if it's identified early. Once type 2 diabetes takes hold, it becomes much more difficult, though certainly not impossible, to achieve durable, normal glucose control. The severity and the chronicity of the disease are directly linked to numerous end-organ complications. Retinopathy leading to blindness, heart and vascular disease, kidney failure, strokes, nerve damage, increased risk of cancers, and even Alzheimer's disease. A massive population study of 46 million people in England really quantified the burden. By age 50, 1/3 of those with diabetes already have at least 3 other chronic conditions. They spend more than 20 years living with them, and they die, on average, 11 years earlier than the general population. Clearly, it's something we want to prevent.
Okay, moving to heart disease. The source uses that vivid image to describe atherosclerosis. The literal translation is hardening of the porridge. What exactly does that mean in biological terms, and why is it so dangerous?
Yeah, that phrase, coined way back in 1904 by the German pathologist Felix Marchand, is actually quite descriptive. He was referring to the fatty material which had an appearance like gruel or porridge that he observed building up inside the arteries. This fatty material is what we now call plaque. It forms when LDL cholesterol and other lipoproteins, those molecules that carry cholesterol in the blood, accumulate in the artery wall. This plaque builds up slowly over decades, and it's accompanied by chronic inflammation within the artery wall. This process literally causes the artery to harden and narrow, much like, hardening porridge. Now, this atherosclerotic process can lead to sudden catastrophic events like a sudden crack or rupture of the plaque, leading to a blood clot, That's the immediate cause of most heart attacks. Or it can be a chronic process where the arterial pipe gradually narrows due to plaque accumulation, limiting blood flow, usually not completely blocking it initially, but causing symptoms like angina. The key takeaway is that the cumulative exposure to elevated LDL cholesterol over time and the magnitude of that elevation is what drives atherosclerosis. And importantly, it is preventable or at least significantly delayable with early intervention. And remember, the same process can occur in any artery, whether it leads to the brain causing stroke, the kidneys causing kidney failure, or the legs causing peripheral artery disease. It's a systemic issue.
LDL cholesterol is often talked about as the key marker here. What's its significance? And are statins still the primary approach to managing it?
Indeed, LDL cholesterol was fully validated as a critical biomarker long before we had things like polygenic risk scores or coronary calcium scores. It's probably one of the most extensively studied laboratory tests in all of medicine. Numerous large clinical trials testing statins have consistently shown a direct relationship. The lower the achieved LDL level, the lower the risk of coronary heart disease events. It's a very clear link. Statins are incredibly widely used and very effective for many. But as many listeners might know, a substantial proportion of people experience muscle aches and cramps, which unfortunately leads some to discontinue the medication, highlighting the need for alternative or complementary therapies.
Okay, so are there newer drugs for managing lipids beyond statins that offer different mechanisms or advantages?
Yes, absolutely. The landscape is evolving rapidly here. We now have PCSK9 inhibitors. These are typically given as injections every 2 to 6 weeks, and they can lower LDL by a very impressive 50 to 60%. Often added on top of statins. There's also inclisiran. This is an RNA interfering drug, a newer technology given as an injection just twice a year. It lowers LDL by about 50% by degrading the messenger RNA for PCSK9. That less frequent dosing is a big advantage for adherence. For high triglycerides, which is another lipid risk factor, new drugs like olezarsen, an antisense drug, are showing around a 50% reduction with monthly injections. Marked lowering of triglycerides is also being achieved with other RNA interfering drugs targeting different genes like AGPTL3 and APC3. And notably, a monoclonal antibody targeting AGPTL3, called evinacumab, has even been approved for treating familial hypercholesterolemia, a severe genetic condition in children. These kids are at extremely high risk for atherosclerosis at a very young age, so having effective treatments is crucial.
What about apolipoprotein B, or ApoB? The material suggests it should be a standard test, maybe even better than LDL, but it's often not included. Why is it considered so important?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point. What's fascinating here is that while ApoB levels typically correlate pretty well with LDL cholesterol levels, many impressive studies indicate that ApoB is actually a more accurate predictor of cardiovascular risk. It's estimated that about 20% of people who have normal LDL cholesterol levels will actually have a high ApoB level, clearly indicating elevated cardiovascular disease risk that would otherwise be missed. This makes biological sense because ApoB is a more direct measurement. It's the actual protein that forms the shell carrying cholesterol particles in our blood, not just LDL, but also other potentially harmful particles like intermediate density lipoproteins, IDL, very low density lipoproteins, VLDL, and LPA. So it gives a better count of the total number of potentially artery clogging particles. It's a really important lab test for people at risk. Those with metabolic syndrome, high triglycerides, maybe a high polygenic risk score. It really should be part of the standard lipid panel covered by insurance, but for various reasons it usually isn't.
It's definitely worth considering getting it checked at least once, especially if you have risk factors, just to see if there's a divergence between your LDL cholesterol and your ApoB levels. It can really help fine-tune your risk assessment. Its glaring omission from standard panels, despite such strong evidence, is something that hopefully will be fixed someday. Okay, and shifting slightly, what role does inflammation play in heart disease beyond just the cholesterol buildup?
A huge role. The preponderance of evidence now points to inflammation as a key culprit, actively underpinning the whole process of atherosclerosis. It's not just a bystander. The blood biomarker high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, hsCRP, serves as a good indicator of this body-wide inflammation. This understanding set the stage for clinical trials designed specifically to test if a potent anti-inflammatory agent could actually suppress heart disease, independent of lowering cholesterol. The landmark Kansas study, published in 2017, did exactly that. It enrolled over 10,000 participants who had already had a heart attack and had elevated hsCRP levels. They were randomly assigned to receive either canakinumab, a monoclonal antibody targeting a specific inflammatory molecule called interleukin-1, or a placebo for nearly 4 years. The results were striking. The drug reduced hsCRP by 40%, and crucially, without any effect on lipid levels, it achieved a significant reduction in the combined rate of heart attack, stroke, and cardiovascular death. This really highlights that inflammation is a distinct and powerful driver of heart disease, completely independent of cholesterol levels.
That is remarkable, an anti-inflammatory drug reducing heart events and cancer, as you mentioned. Were there any downsides to that specific drug, canakinumab?
Yes, there was a downside, which likely contributed to the decision not to pursue the cardiovascular indication. There was a small but statistically significant increase in fatal infections or sepsis in the group receiving the drug, 0.3%, compared with the placebo group, 0.18%. This reflects the drug's immune suppression effect. Dampening inflammation can sometimes make you more susceptible to infections. But, as you noted, the trial also found that significant reduction of fatal cancer, particularly lung cancer. So it was a complex picture. A potent anti-inflammatory drug suppressed both heart events and cancer, but carried a small absolute increased risk of fatal infection. Weighing those risks and benefits is always tricky.
So were there other anti-inflammatory approaches tested for heart disease that maybe didn't have the same infection risk?
Yes, another approach used colchicine. This is an inexpensive, orally administered anti-inflammatory drug that's actually been around for thousands of years, originally derived from the autumn crocus plant. Its main side effect is usually gastrointestinal distress, like diarrhea. A randomized trial in nearly 5,000 patients who had recently had a heart attack showed a significant reduction of cardiovascular events with colchicine compared with placebo, although there was an increased incidence of pneumonia noted in that specific trial. Another large trial, this time in over 5,000 people with chronic coronary artery disease, also showed about a 30% reduction in cardiovascular events with colchicine, although there was an excess of non-cardiovascular deaths observed in that trial, which complicated the picture. However, collectively, the consistent results across these trials strongly suggest that an anti-inflammatory drug can reduce heart attacks, stroke, and cardiovascular deaths. Based on this, in June 2023, the FDA approved a specific low-dose version of colchicine, branded as Lodoco, as the first drug ever specifically indicated to treat cardiovascular inflammation.
But its retail price is at least tenfold higher than the generic version. And despite strong aggregate data from pooled trials, now showing no significant overall risk of infection with low-dose colchicine, neither the branded nor the generic version is widely used in routine medical practice for this purpose yet. This again raises that important question: why aren't we routinely adopting therapies with such clear benefits demonstrated in multiple trials, especially when generic versions are inexpensive and widely available? It's a real puzzle.
So pulling all this together, what does the path forward look like for preventing coronary artery disease? How can we integrate all these new insights, genetics, imaging, inflammation, new drugs?
There's a clear vision emerging for a much more proactive and personalized approach. Using multimodal AI combining genetic risk scores, advanced imaging like CT scans looking for coronary artery inflammation, blood biomarkers like hsCRP and ApoB, and electronic health records, we can get much better at identifying high-risk individuals very early on. Once someone is deemed high risk, we can put them on active surveillance and take aggressive steps to block the progression of both atherosclerosis and inflammation. This includes promoting comprehensive lifestyle factors, obviously, but also initiating close monitoring with imaging and blood markers. We know that more aggressive blood pressure management, targeting less than 120 millimeter Hg systolic, prevents major vascular events that's proven in large randomized trials. High-intensity statins are foundational, but if LDL or ApoB remain high, or if inflammation markers like hsCRP persist despite lifestyle improvements in statins, then adding drugs like PCSK9 inhibitors or even anti-inflammatory drugs like colchicine can be considered. And the material suggests that even better anti-inflammatory drugs or perhaps gut microbiome modulation strategies will undoubtedly become available in the future. This kind of sophisticated heart disease forecasting and prevention effort reflects an unprecedented power. The ability to identify high-risk status at the individual level much earlier in a person's life and even potentially predict the timing of when a condition might begin to manifest. That's the goal.
Okay, let's shift to cancer. For far too long, we've waged this war on cancer, declared presidentially way back in 1971, and honestly, too many people are still losing that battle. This material suggests we need a fundamentally new approach, not just a brute force military operation.
Exactly. That war metaphor might have been useful initially, but it implies a single enemy and a single strategy. The reality is much more complex. Expanding health span requires smarter use of our vast cancer knowledge base, leveraging all 5 dimensions we talked about earlier: lifestyle, omics like genomics, AI, cellular therapies, and drugs vaccines. We know so much more about the biology of different cancers now that we really can transform the practice of medicine. And much of that knowledge is actually ready for people to use now or very soon. It's about precision, personalization, and smarter strategies, not just brute force. But one major issue that the material highlights right away is the problem of unnecessary delays in getting effective treatments to patients who need them.
That delay sounds tragic. Can you elaborate on that? What kind of delays are we talking about?
It really is tragic when you think about it. The source gives examples.
Oh.
Patients with certain types of breast or gynecologic cancer had to wait 7 to 10 years before they could receive nivolumab, Opdivo. This is an immunotherapy drug, a monoclonal antibody targeting the PD-L1 protein, which was known to be effective, 7 to 10 years. Similarly, drugs called PRP inhibitors like olaparib, Lynparza, were shown way back in 2005 to be effective at killing cancer cells with specific BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutations. But it took up to 6 years for formal approval for treating breast, pancreatic, and prostate cancers with these mutations. The source estimates that with such delays, maybe around 200,000 people who might have benefited from these drugs earlier potentially lost their lives waiting. We now have so many treatments targeted to specific mutations, but the potential to apply them is too often lost because cancer treatment is still largely classified by the organ of origin, lung, breast, colon, rather than the underlying molecular drivers. We frequently miss opportunities because patients don't get comprehensive molecular characterization of their tumor early enough. And that's just heartbreaking, especially now when the cost of sequencing has dropped dramatically. And AI tools can often help identify driver mutations and even predict response to immunotherapy.
So that molecular characterization of a tumor is absolutely key for modern cancer treatment then. How does that work in practice? What are we looking for?
It's vital. It's becoming the cornerstone of precision oncology. The molecular characterization of a person's cancer is crucial because many specific mutations now guide the use of FDA-approved treatments. We're talking about identifying changes in specific genes and the proteins they produce that are actually driving the cancer's growth. Important genes with known mutations that can be targeted include HER2 in breast cancer, BRCA12, breast, ovarian, pancreatic, prostate, EGFR, lung, NTRK, ALK, BRAF, melanoma, thyroid, colon, and many, many others. Even a gene called KRAS, which was once considered undruggable for many gastrointestinal and other cancers, now has FDA-approved treatments targeting specific KRAS mutations, and these appear quite effective, with more potentially on the way, maybe even things called molecular glues. The source gives a stark example. In patients with advanced non-small cell lung cancer carrying a specific ALK mutation, the 5-year survival rate improved from just 8% with traditional therapy to an incredible 60% using lorlatinib, which is a pill specifically targeting the ALK and RS1 genes. That's transformative. Beyond just looking for specific mutations, examining the tumor's genome sequence for broader markers like microsatellite instability, MSI, can also provide insight and point towards specific FDA-approved immunotherapy drugs like pembrolizumab. However, it's important to add a caveat. Some of these mutation-targeted drugs have been proven to shrink or eliminate tumors as seen on scans, but sometimes without substantially improving overall cancer survival in the long run. Tumor shrinkage doesn't always perfectly translate to longer life, which is an important nuance.
What about early detection of cancer? That seems like the ultimate goal for improving outcomes long term. How are we doing there?
That's the holy grail. But the detection rate for truly early cancer stage 1 and 2 is still disappointingly poor compared with detecting later stage disease when symptoms often appear. The key is picking up cancer at the microscopic stage, maybe even just some DNA fragments shed into the blood before it can be seen on a scan or cause symptoms. That's where interventions could potentially change the natural history of cancer progression most effectively. But it's crucial to understand that simply detecting something early isn't always equivalent to favorably altering outcomes. You need to know that the intervention you apply after detection actually makes a difference. Overdiagnosis is a real concern. That's why large randomized trials are absolutely necessary for these new multi-cancer early detection MCED tests. There are huge ones underway, like one by the National Health Service in the UK involving 140,000 participants, and another by the National Cancer Institute in the US with 225,000 participants, mostly using age as the main inclusion criterion. It will likely be years before these trials provide definitive results on clinical outcomes like mortality. And there will be questions about participant diversity, since we know cancer occurrence and behavior can be shaped by ancestry. But perhaps the biggest practical problem right now is that none of these promising early detection blood tests are yet FDA approved or reimbursed by insurance carriers, creating a significant barrier to widespread adoption even if they prove effective.
And what about immunotherapy? That feels like it's been a true game changer in the cancer fight recently. What are the latest advances there?
Immunotherapy advancements are truly ramping up our ability to harness the patient's own immune system against cancer. It's a very exciting field. There's a newer group of antibodies called bispecific T-cell engagers, or BiTEs. These cleverly designed molecules act like a bridge, connecting a tumor cell to an immune T-cell, basically forcing the T-cell to recognize and attack the cancer cell. Several BiTEs are now approved for various blood cancers, and many more are in clinical trials for solid tumors as well. Another approach uses modified oncolytic viruses. These are viruses engineered to specifically infect and kill tumor cells, but also to change the tumor's environment immunologically, turning it from cold, ignored by the immune system, to hot, making it visible and triggering inflammatory responses. This can work with or without combining them with checkpoint inhibitors like nivolumab. While they had a somewhat checkered track record historically, recent reports in tough cancers like bladder cancer are looking more promising. And there's carcotherapy. This is where a patient's T cells are removed, genetically engineered in the lab to express a receptor specifically targeting their cancer cells, expanded into large numbers, and then reinfused back into the patient. Along with personalized neoantigen vaccines made specifically against the unique mutations in a person's tumor. CAR T therapy can be considered the quintessential individualized medical intervention. We're seeing dramatic results in some cases. For recurrent glioblastoma, one of the most deadly brain cancers, CAR T cells delivered directly into the brain showed rapid and sometimes dramatic tumor regression in early trials. This excellent brain tumor response was also seen in another approach using intravenous administration of mRNA delivered via lipid nanoparticles, similar to the COVID vaccines. It's really remarkable how these engineered T-cell therapies and cancer vaccines have evolved together, broadening the ways we can improve a person's immune response to their specific cancer. The number of potential combinations is just astounding, combining CRT, oncolytic viruses, anti-tumor antibodies, vaccines, BiTEs, activating other immune cells like dendritic cells, even modifying the gut microbiome, plus very small molecule drugs. It's hard to even grasp just how much better we are becoming at deploying the most bespoke, individualized treatment for a given person's cancer.
What about dietary strategies or common medications that have sometimes been considered for cancer prevention? Is there clear guidance there?
Yeah, the prevention side is often trickier. Take aspirin, for example. We discussed it for heart disease, but what about cancer? A large randomized trial in over 19,000 participants aged 65 and older showed no reduction in cardiovascular disease or disability-free survival with low-dose aspirin, and actually found a significant excess of major bleeding events. So in 2022, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force officially stopped recommending aspirin solely to prevent colon cancer or cardiovascular events in older adults. For people aged 40 to 59, their guidance became quite vague, stating, "Clinicians should decide for themselves." This really begs the question, as the source puts it. How fuzzy is that? But how much better could we do if we precisely defined risk before testing an intervention and recommending it at mass scale based on just one factor, age? We need more personalized prevention strategies. As for diet and cancer risk, most of the strong evidence comes from experimental models, not large human trials. These models show increased risk from things like high fructose corn syrup, and potential benefits from specific dietary patterns like methionine restriction, caloric restriction, ketogenic diets, or low glycemic diets. However, translating this to humans is complex. A randomized trial looked at significantly increasing vegetable consumption versus a control diet in 478 men with early-stage prostate cancer. Unfortunately, it did not significantly affect the cancer's progression. It shows that sometimes even seemingly healthy dietary changes might have only modest effects on specific cancer outcomes. On the other hand, foods associated with unfavorable inflammation markers were linked to a higher risk of colon cancer in a large study of over 120,000 people, reinforcing the inflammation connection. Foods often linked to potentially lowering cancer risk include those rich in isothiocyanates, like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, lycopenes from tomatoes, high-fiber foods, legumes, nuts, walnuts, antioxidants, and flavonoids found in berries, pomegranates, and garlic. But again, proving definitive prevention in humans is tough.
And what about the drug finasteride for prostate cancer prevention? That also seems to have a rather complex and unsettled story.
It does. It's quite telling, actually. Back in 2003, a large randomized trial, nearly 19,000 men aged 55 and older, showed a significant 25% reduction in prostate cancer diagnosis over a 7-year follow-up period with finasteride. That seemed very promising. Later analysis extended the follow-up period out to 16 years and beyond. It found persistent evidence of that 25% reduction in diagnosis, but the number of deaths from prostate cancer was small in both groups, and the difference was no longer statistically significant. Then, a systematic review pooling data from 8 randomized trials confirmed about a 30% reduction in diagnosis with finasteride, but there was a catch. The prostate cancers that were diagnosed in the finasteride group tended to be of a higher, more aggressive malignant grade. One possible explanation for this is that finasteride markedly lowers PSA, prostate-specific antigen levels, which might mask the cancer and delay the diagnosis until it's more advanced. So this remains a really unsettled issue. There are currently no major guidelines recommending finasteride purely for preventing prostate cancer, despite the observed reduction in diagnoses. And pulling back, what's truly fascinating, or maybe frustrating here, is that despite all these incredible insights into cancer biology, prevention, and treatment, we seem to be ignoring some extraordinary opportunities. Why aren't we routinely assessing body-wide inflammation and building on the success seen with anti-inflammatory drugs, like that interleukin-1 drug in the CANTOS trial that significantly reduced fatal cancers, especially lung cancer? Why aren't we more aggressively tackling air pollution, which the evidence strongly suggests is promoting cancer? We essentially have a working blueprint for preventing so much cancer, but we seem to be ignoring many of these major opportunities right in front of us. Now, we definitely need to revamp our approaches to cancer across the board: screening, diagnostic accuracy, using novel molecular diagnostics, tailoring treatments, and focusing on prevention. But realistically, it will take years before we see the necessary updated changes reflected in standard guidelines and routine medical practice. So at the population level, we simply cannot add many years of healthy aging without applying the remarkable progress we've already made in our knowledge base much more effectively. But hopefully, this chapter, at the individual level, offers a valuable anchor for your own decisions and for discussions with your family members about navigating cancer risk and treatment options. The deep connections. Brain health, rare diseases, autoimmunity, and vaccines.
Okay, let's move on to the brain. It's so central to healthy aging, obviously. What does the latest research say about diet and brain health, particularly when it comes to preventing Alzheimer's disease?
Well, the evidence on diet specifically for Alzheimer's prevention is a bit mixed. The Mediterranean DASH intervention for neurodegenerative delay, thankfully shortened to the MIND diet, was tested in a randomized trial. It involved 604 participants who had a family history of Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, the MIND diet did not show a significant benefit compared to a control diet that had just mild caloric restriction. However, a prior double-blind randomized trial conducted in Finland, with over 1,200 participants, tested a more comprehensive intervention. This included the Mediterranean diet, yes, but also aerobic and strength training exercise and cognitive training. That multifaceted approach did show marked improvements in complex memory, executive functioning, and mental processing speed. This suggests that a combination approach is likely more effective for brain health than focusing on diet alone. And conversely, as we highlighted earlier, diets high in ultra-processed foods have been linked to an increased risk of dementia, suggesting that what you avoid eating might be just as important as what you include.
How does the environment factor into Alzheimer's risk? That seems like a growing area of concern, moving beyond just genetics and lifestyle.
Yes, the role of the environment is definitely receiving more and more attention, and rightly so. Multiple studies now reinforce the impact of air pollution on brain health. One study looked at the brains of 224 participants with Alzheimer's disease after death. They found that exposure to traffic-related particulate matter correlated with a near doubling of Alzheimer's risk. And this effect was prominent even among people who did not have the main genetic risk factor, the APOE4 allele. Another study using explainable AI looked at the relationship between air pollution and Alzheimer's in Italy. It revealed that ozone and nitrogen dioxide seemed to be the main pollutant contributors in that population. Beyond air pollution, concerns have been raised based on epigenetic changes, those modifications to gene expression linked to exposure to various heavy metals, cadmium, arsenic, lead, mercury, aflatoxin B1, a toxin found in some foods, endocrine-disrupting chemicals like BPA and PBBs, pesticides, alcohol, and tobacco. It's a long list of potential environmental insults.
And you mentioned microplastics showing up in our brains earlier. That sounds incredibly alarming.
Yeah.
Yes, it is alarming. The concern over the pervasive presence of microplastics and nanoplastics, which we know we inhale and ingest, and which can circulate in our bloodstream, has recently been amplified by the discovery of these particles directly within human brain tissue. These plastics appear to have an alarming capacity to incite inflammation within the brain, which could potentially contribute to neurodegenerative processes over time. Other common environmental chemicals, like quaternary ammonium compounds found in disinfectants and personal care products, or organophosphate flame retardants used in furniture and electronics, have been shown in lab studies to impair the development of critical brain cells called oligodendrocytes. An extensive study looked at various modifiable factors associated with brain aging. It concluded that diabetes, air pollution, and alcohol intake were the most deleterious risk factors overall. The 2024 Lancet Commission report on dementia added untreated vision loss and high LDL cholesterol to the list of modifiable risk factors. They estimated that potentially 45% of dementia cases worldwide could be prevented or significantly delayed by addressing these known factors. And based on other data reviewed on sleep health, unprocessed food intake, and the increased risk seen after severe COVID in older adults, the source suggests the number of potentially modifiable factors might be closer to 17. This implies that perhaps up to half of the global burden of dementia could be substantially reduced if we could effectively address these risks. Which again raises that crucial question. If we know so much about these modifiable risk factors, why is dementia still so prevalent and devastating? Where's the disconnect?
What about current treatments for Alzheimer's? Is there any real hope on the horizon there?
Well, the main approach targeting amyloid protein buildup is currently described as being on fallow ground, despite past FDA support for drugs like aducanumab. Newer anti-amyloid antibodies like lecanemab and donanemab do bind to different parts of the amyloid protein, and they do clear plaques somewhat. Donanemab seems strongest. But ultimately, they achieve only a small, modest clinical benefit in slowing cognitive decline for patients who already have symptoms. It's not the breakthrough many had hoped for. Because of this limited benefit in symptomatic patients, the field has largely shifted towards testing these antibodies much earlier in people who are asymptomatic, but show biomarker evidence of risk, like elevated levels of p-tau217 in the blood. Multiple clinical trials are underway testing this prevention strategy. The hope is that intervening before significant tau protein accumulation and more advanced brain damage occurs will decrease the risk and augment the potential benefit. Another direction is testing multi-pronged therapies, simultaneously targeting beta amyloid, tau protein tangles, and the gliosis-linked brain inflammation that accompanies the disease. Tau-directed therapies themselves, including monoclonal antibodies, antisense oligonucleotides, which block tau production, and even vaccines against tau, are also being actively pursued in clinical trials.
And are there any other, perhaps more novel approaches being explored for brain health and Alzheimer's?
Yes, there are several other avenues being investigated, though most are still in early stages. In a small randomized trial with 50 participants who had mild to moderate Alzheimer's, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, RTMS, using magnetic pulses to stimulate brain activity appeared to modestly slow cognitive decline compared to a sham control group. There's also a headset device being developed that uses gamma-frequency light and sound stimulation. Preliminary data suggests it might slow cognitive decline and prevent brain atrophy. It's currently completing a larger trial needed for potential FDA approval. And researchers are also exploring repurposing existing drugs, things like intranasal insulin, Viagra, sildenafil, even a common loop diuretic water pill for potential benefits in Alzheimer's based on observational data or mechanistic hypotheses. But it's crucial to emphasize that none of these alternative treatments has yet been validated by large, rigorous randomized trials. So significant caution is warranted until we have better evidence.
Okay, moving on to Parkinson's disease. How are we doing in terms of early detection and treatment for Parkinson's?
The hunt for a reliable biomarker for Parkinson's has definitely lagged behind Alzheimer's historically, but some recent work looking at alpha-synuclein, the protein that clumps abnormally in Parkinson's, is very encouraging. Specifically, techniques called alpha-synuclein seed amplification assays, SAA, usually performed on cerebrospinal fluid obtained via spinal tap, seem capable of identifying individuals with Parkinson's with high sensitivity and specificity. This was recently validated in a large study involving over 1,100 participants, including people with Parkinson's, those with precursor signs like loss of smell or REM sleep behavior disorder, and even carriers of genetic mutations who hadn't yet manifested the disease. Being able to differentiate carriers who will develop the disease from those who won't, using a biomarker like this presents a real potential advantage for enrolling people in prevention trials very early. Alternatively, performing this SAA assay on samples obtained from a simple skin biopsy, looking for phosphorylated alpha-synuclein, also shows high accuracy. That would avoid the need for a spinal tap, making it much more practical.
Various types of PET imaging can also detect changes related to Parkinson's with high sensitivity, but they're not widely available, they're expensive, and they involve radiation exposure. So the good news is that with these new biomarker studies, we may finally be on the cusp of breaking through with ways to detect Parkinson's much earlier. This could enable interventions aimed at preserving brain health so that people can reach advanced age while remaining motorically and cognitively crisp.
Now, the title of this next section, Curing Rare Diseases, might seem a bit surprising in a discussion focused on general health span and common age-related conditions. Why is it included here? What's the connection?
That's a great question. It's included because the cutting-edge approaches we're currently developing to cure rare genetic diseases are likely to play an increasingly important role in managing and maybe even curing common diseases in the future. Think about genome editing, arguably the most consequential life science breakthrough of our era. It's already being applied in trials for patients with certain cancers and even some forms of heart disease, which are common conditions. That's really just the beginning. The material even suggests, perhaps provocatively, that your children or grandchildren may well undergo some form of genome editing during their lifetime. That makes this relevant to all of us. And what's fascinating here, something many people don't realize, is that while each individual rare disease affects only a small number of people, collectively, rare diseases are actually quite common. They affect a significant portion of the population globally when you add them all up.
Okay, can you explain the different types of gene editing that are now available or emerging? It seems like the technology is evolving rapidly.
It really is. Think of gene editing as having gone through different versions, like software. Before CRISPR became famous, we had earlier tools like zinc finger nucleases, ZFNs, and transcription activator-like effector nucleases, TALENs. These were like very precise molecular scissors that could cut DNA, but they were quite difficult to program accurately for specific targets. Then, over the past decade, CRISPR technology arrived and has undergone intensive refinement to improve its accuracy and precision, significantly reducing the risk of making unintended cuts elsewhere in the genome, so-called off-target effects. All three of these types of nucleases work by cutting both strands of the DNA double helix. The cell's natural repair machinery usually fixes these breaks accurately, but a small percentage of the time, mistakes happen during the repair. The nucleus keeps cutting the DNA at the target site, and the repair process keeps following, sometimes accumulating more mistakes, until eventually the DNA sequence is altered enough that the nucleus no longer recognizes it. This effectively disrupts or knocks out the targeted gene. This is essentially what we call CRISPR 1.0. It's a disruptive gene knockout strategy. Crucially, it cannot fix a mutated gene. It can only disable it. Now, gene therapy is different. It's more like gene addition. Instead of fixing a specific broken part, you're adding a new functional copy of the gene into the cells. It's like putting a new working part into a car to compensate for a broken one. It doesn't correct the underlying genetic defect itself, and it has traditionally relied on engineered viruses to deliver the new gene. About 15 different gene therapies were actually approved for the first CRISPR-based therapy, Casgevy, starting way back in 2012. Approvals have greatly expanded since then for conditions like spinal muscular atrophy, hemophilia A and B, beta thalassemia, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and severe combined immunodeficiency, SCID or bubble boy disease. Remarkably, a single injection gene therapy to restore hearing in children born with a specific type of genetic deafness has even been demonstrated recently without adverse side effects. This could potentially open the door for treating a wide array of hearing loss conditions, maybe even age-related hearing loss, presbycusis, in the future. Clinical trials using gene therapy for central nervous system conditions like ALS, Parkinson's, and Huntington's disease are also ongoing.
And how are these sophisticated gene editing tools or gene therapies actually delivered into the body? That seems like a major technical hurdle.
It is. Delivery is often the biggest challenge. Getting these editors or therapeutic genes to the right cells in the right tissues, safely and efficiently, is a major focus of current research. For non-viral delivery, lipid nanoparticles like those used for the mRNA COVID vaccines are being constantly improved. All four key components of these nanoparticles are being refined for better stability and wider reach within the body. For example, gold nanoparticles have shown enhanced potential for editing blood stem cells ex vivo outside the body. Synthetic nanoparticles are being engineered to allow editors to get into the brain, spleen, and muscle, with ongoing work trying to reach the heart, lungs, and bone marrow effectively in vivo inside the body. Another direction is engineering enveloped delivery vehicles, EDVs, or more specifically things called virus-like particles, VLPs. These are essentially gutted viruses that are non-infectious but retain the virus's ability to enter cells effectively. They provide increased room inside to carry larger cargo like mRNA or proteins needed for editing. Progress has been made using VLPs for highly efficient delivery of base editors to the liver and prime editors to the retina in animal models, with huge increases in efficiency compared to previous methods. The big advantage of these highly efficient VLP systems is potentially their short exposure time in the body, which could reduce the opportunity for off-target editing. With all these different tactics being pursued to improve efficiency and reach, we'll surely see more progress in systemic delivery soon.
What other kinds of editing are on the horizon beyond cutting DNA or adding whole genes?
There are a couple of other exciting approaches gaining traction. One is RNA editing. This directly changes the sequence of RNA molecules, which are the messengers copied from DNA, rather than altering the DNA blueprint itself. A key feature is that RNA edits are temporary, because RNA molecules are constantly being turned over in the cell. This could be an advantage for situations where you only need a transient effect and might be perceived as safer than permanent DNA changes. You could have broad applicability, for example, to temporarily alter RNA sequences in cancer cells in a way that leads to tumor cell death. And then there's epigenome editing, which is drawing considerable attention right now. Like RNA editing, it doesn't change the DNA sequence or the protein directly. Instead, it controls the regulation of genes, tweaking their on-off switches or dialing their activity levels up or down. It's also generally temporary, often described as a hit-and-run approach. The term gene tuning has been applied because, like adjusting the settings on a soundboard, epigenetic marks can be modified to harmonize the expression of multiple genes at once, not just turning single genes fully on or off. The potential for an enhanced safety profile compared to DNA cutting is very alluring. And the results from mouse studies are intriguing, showing promise for cholesterol lowering, Alzheimer's, Huntington's disease, a rare inherited form of obesity, Dravet syndrome, modulating a pain perception gene, and even permeating the brains of mice to silence the production of neuron-killing prion proteins. Some early studies use viral vectors, like AAV, to deliver the epigenetic editors, which can undermine the desired transient effect. But other cargo delivery techniques are being explored, like using exosomes delivered intranasally, loaded with an epigenetic editor, which was successful in reducing beta-amyloid production in mouse brains. Epigenetic silencing of the PCSK9 gene in mice using non-viral nanoparticles led to marked and durable cholesterol lowering, which bodes well for avoiding AAV delivery in the future. Companies are now forming specifically to develop epigenetic editing therapies to treat chronic diseases, modulate aging, or target liver cells in hepatitis B or cancer patients. These are clearly ambitious programs. But if successful, they could have a transformative impact well beyond just rare genetic disorders.
This all sounds incredibly advanced and promising, but it also inevitably brings up significant ethical and practical questions, doesn't it? Especially regarding things like germline editing and equitable access.
Absolutely. The material explicitly discusses these crucial ethical, legal, and equity questions. They cannot be ignored. The most prominent example was back in 2018, when the rogue Chinese scientist He Jiankui announced the birth of twin babies after he'd performed CRISPR editing on human embryos. This was the first known instance of human germline editing. That means the edits he made were not just present in the babies' bodies, likely as a mosaic across different cells, but could also be transmitted to their future offspring, affecting the human gene pool. This act shook the global science community to its core, leading to strong condemnations describing it as misguided, reckless, and ethically indefensible. And then there's the cost, which is a major practical hurdle. Casgevy, the first FDA-approved CRISPR therapy for sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia, cost $2.2 million per patient for the treatment. While manufacturing costs could potentially be reduced over time, this extremely high price, combined with limited access to the complex treatment process, means that the people who arguably have the most to gain, often those in underserved communities with limited resources, will likely be the least able to derive the benefit. This again starkly highlights the equity issue. On the positive side, the cost of sequencing a whole human genome is now down to around $100. This is democratizing access to foundational genomic information. AI is also making strides in enabling comprehensive genome interpretation, helping to diagnose rare genetic diseases much faster, which has demonstrably saved lives. Yet another powerful tool, metagenomics, which uses comprehensive sequencing to identify pathogens rapidly, has been known since 2014, but as the source notes has largely been collecting dust, despite its proven ability to make diagnoses quickly and accurately where traditional methods fail. This really raises that important question again. How can we ensure these life-saving technologies are not only developed, but are actually accessible and utilized equitably for everyone who needs them, not just a privileged few?
Let's turn our attention now to autoimmune conditions, where the body's immune system mistakenly attacks its own tissues. Can you give us a brief sketch of how this happens?
Sure, it's complex, but here's a simplified picture. Imagine a virus infects the body. The virus presents certain molecules, called antigens, to the immune system. Now, if one of those viral antigens happens to look very similar to a protein or molecule that's normally part of the person's own body, a phenomenon called molecular mimicry, basically a case of mistaken identity problems can arise. Specialized immune cells, called dendritic cells, detect the infection and activate T cells. But because of the mimicry, these activated T cells might connect to both the viral antigen and the similar self-antigen. This can lead to CD8 plus killer T cells, destroying not only the virus-infected cells, but also the person's own healthy cells that display the similar self-antigen. At the same time, other T cells, called CD4 plus helper T cells, can activate B cells to start producing autoantibodies, antibodies that mistakenly attack the body's own proteins. Both these self-reactive B cells and CD8 plus T cells can then evolve into long-lived memory cells, transforming what might have been an acute response to the initial infection into a chronic, self-sustaining autoimmune disease. So most autoimmune conditions likely arise from a combination of two main factors: an underlying genetic susceptibility, meaning some people are just more prone, and then a second hit or trigger, often a viral infection like Epstein-Barr virus, strongly linked to multiple sclerosis, or Coxsackie-B4 virus, linked to type 1 diabetes. Multiple environmental factors can also play a role in stimulating this aberrant immune response, including cigarette smoking, which has lasting effects, air pollution, pesticides, exposure to ultraviolet light, and even chronic stress.
And there's that significant gender disparity in autoimmune diseases, right? With roughly 3 out of 4 individuals affected being women. Why is that?
That's right. It's a very striking disparity, and the full explanation has been elusive for a long time. It clearly has something to do with females having 2 X chromosomes, whereas males have 1 X and 1 Y. Normally in females, a molecule called cyst RNA coats and randomly inactivates one of the 2 X chromosomes in each cell, effectively silencing most of its gene expression to balance the dosage with males. But recent research suggests that sometimes cyst essentially breaks loose or fails to properly deactivate gene expression on the inactivated X. More importantly, cyst itself, along with proteins that bind to it, can form complexes that trigger a pernicious immune response. Autoantibodies against these cyst protein complexes have been identified in women with autoimmune diseases like lupus, scleroderma, and dermatomyositis. However, this is likely only a partial explanation. For instance, most people diagnosed with type 1 diabetes are actually male, and about 20% of all autoimmune conditions are found in XY individuals, males. So other factors must be involved. Sex hormones, like estrogen and testosterone, may also play a role, as suggested by observations like plasma estradiol concentration correlating with antibody levels developed after flu shots. It's a complex interplay.
So what's the good news? Are we moving beyond just broadly suppressing the immune system to treat these conditions? Is prevention or restoring tolerance becoming possible?
Yes, that's the exciting part. Historically, we haven't really had effective strategies to prevent common autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes, lupus, multiple sclerosis, or rheumatoid arthritis. Treatment has relied heavily on broad immune suppression, using drugs like steroids or methotrexate, which comes with significant side effects, like increased infection risk. But now, with the ability to integrate multimodal AI with genomic data, biomarkers from blood tests, and electronic health records, we're getting much better at identifying groups of individuals who are at high risk before they develop the disease. This capability is building the foundation for true prevention strategies. The ultimate goal in autoimmune treatment, the holy grail, is to restore durable immune tolerance, basically, retraining the immune system to ignore the self-antigens it's mistakenly attacking without causing broad immunosuppression. We have 2 main levels of immune tolerance naturally. Central tolerance, which happens in the thymus gland during T-cell development, where self-reactive T-cells are eliminated, and peripheral tolerance, which refers to all the mechanisms operating outside the thymus that protect against self-reactive T-cells that escape central tolerance, often by deactivating them or turning them into regulatory key cells, TREGs. And the totality of evidence now strongly suggests that manipulating the gut microbiome will likely evolve to be an important pathway for promoting anti-inflammatory effects or even inducing tolerance. Microorganisms in our gut produce metabolites, especially short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, that directly modulate immune cell function. A pro-inflammatory gut environment can disrupt the intestinal barrier, allowing microbes or their products to leak into the bloodstream, triggering systemic inflammation. Plus, there's the bidirectional gut-brain axis, where the enteric nervous system in the gut, sometimes called the second brain, communicates extensively with the central nervous system, influencing mood, behavior, and even regulating our motivation to exercise. So, potential manipulation methods being explored include probiotics, using specific beneficial bacterial strains, fecal transplantation, targeted antibiotics, vaccines against certain gut microbes, and of course, dietary interventions designed to reshape the microbiome.
That's fascinating. Can you give us some specific examples of progress being made in targeting tolerance for particular autoimmune conditions? Is this happening now?
Yes, this is a truly revolutionary time for autoimmune disease therapy development. It's happening now. Consider this. The first drug ever proven to actually delay the onset of an autoimmune disease was approved by the FDA in 2022. The disease was type 1 diabetes. Since way back in 1999, researchers have been studying how to interrupt the T-cell attack on the insulin-producing beta islet cells in the pancreas and achieve tolerance. A monoclonal antibody called teplizumab was shown in a randomized trial to significantly delay the clinical onset of type 1 diabetes in high-risk relatives who had autoantibodies but weren't yet diabetic. It also improved beta cell function. For some individuals in the trial, the delay was years, and some may never develop clinical diabetes. This landmark approval really opens the door for developing more effective or complementary prevention methods, perhaps using even more specific antibodies, targeting only the T cells that attack insulin-producing cells or combining approaches.
What other approaches are being explored specifically for type 1 diabetes, T1D prevention, or treatment?
There are quite a few promising avenues for T1D. An antiviral approach, using drugs plecanaril and ribavirin in newly diagnosed patients, showed some success in preserving beta cell function, supporting the viral trigger hypothesis. Baricitinib, a potent anti-inflammatory drug, a JAK inhibitor, also demonstrated preservation of beta cell function when given to newly diagnosed patients. An intralymphatic injection of an autoantigen called JD-alum seemed to improve glycemic control, but only in younger patients with a specific genetic HLA type, highlighting the need for personalized approaches. A vaccine against Coxsackie B viruses, which are strongly associated with triggering T1D, has been developed and is awaiting evaluation in clinical trials. Efforts to promote tolerance using oral, powdered insulin, aimed at inducing TREGs in the gut, are showing promise in early studies. While direct infusions of TREG cells themselves failed in one trial, the results suggested that the quality of the TREGs might be more important than the quantity. The gut microbiome is clearly influential, with strategies like introducing specific beneficial bacteria like Bifidobacterium longum being assessed in trials. Preventing childhood obesity, which is another risk factor for T1D, is also essential. Even the GLP-1 drugs we discussed earlier might have potential to help preserve beta cell function in early T1D, although that needs further exploration. And perhaps most futuristically, stem cell-derived pancreatic islet cells have successfully eliminated the need for insulin injections in a few patients in a clinical trial. But this required ongoing immunosuppressant drugs to prevent rejection. The next step would be genome-edited beta cells designed to evade the immune system entirely.
What about progress in other autoimmune diseases like IBD or celiac disease? Are we seeing similar advances?
Yes, absolutely. Again and again, one line of research seems to spark insights in multiple others. A recent discovery in inflammatory bowel disease, IBD, identified a specific type of immune cell in the gut lining, intraepithelial lymphocytes, whose dysfunction seems tied to loss of self-recognition. Understanding this pathway could lead to future immune tolerance strategies for IBD. For celiac disease, where patients are currently stuck with a very difficult lifelong gluten-free diet, several companies are now in clinical trials. They're using modified gluten proteins delivered in nanoparticles as an antigen-specific therapy. The goal is to retrain the specific CD4 plus T cells that react to gluten, inducing tolerance so patients might eventually be able to eat gluten again safely. A major genetic discovery recently identified a specific inflammatory pathway that seems to underpin IBD and likely other autoimmune diseases. Targeting this specific pathway with new drugs could offer a much more focused approach than the current broad immunosuppression. And many other therapies are in the pipeline across various autoimmune diseases, including TREG cell therapies and targeted microbiome interventions. And what's really fascinating here is seeing technologies cross over. Even CAR T-cell therapy, initially developed for cancer, showed in a mouse model that a single infusion could provide durable protection against asthma attacks, potentially targeting an autoimmune component of that common disease. The antibody-drug conjugate, ADC strategy, which combines a targeting antibody with a potent drug payload initially used for cancer, is now being tested in clinical trials for autoimmune diseases. For example, Combining a TNF-blocking antibody with a glucocorticoid payload aims to deliver the steroid directly to inflamed tissues, maximizing efficacy while minimizing systemic side effects. Bispecific T-cell engagers, BiTE, also from the cancer world, are now in trials for refractory rheumatoid arthritis. So there's huge cross-pollination of ideas.
And that leads us naturally to organ transplantation, where controlling the immune response is absolutely critical to prevent rejection.
Exactly. Back in 2015, the genomics pioneer George Church suggested, somewhat audaciously at the time, that it would eventually be possible to edit tens, maybe even hundreds, of genes simultaneously in an animal like a pig. The goal: to create organs that could be transplanted into humans without triggering an immune rejection response, essentially. Successful xenotransplantation. At the time, with CRISPR still in its early days, that seemed pretty far-fetched to many. But fast forward to today, and we are actually seeing pig organs being developed with more than 60 different genomic edits. These edits aim to knock out pig genes that trigger hyperacute rejection in humans, block inflammatory pathways like the complement cascade, reduce blood clotting risks, and even inactivate latent pig retroviruses that could potentially infect the recipient. All the sophisticated cell and antibody strategies we've just discussed for promoting immune tolerance in autoimmune disease are also coming into play to try and prevent rejection of these xenografts. Acute and chronic organ rejection still remains a serious risk, make no mistake. But given the dire shortage of human donor organs, remember, 17 people die each day in the U.S. alone or waiting for a transplant. The progress being made in xenotransplantation is truly mind-blowing and offers immense hope for the future.
Okay, let's talk vaccines. The COVID-19 pandemic obviously threw us into an existential crisis. How quickly did our understanding and capabilities in vaccine development transform during that period? It felt like a fundamental shift.
It really did. In early 2020, if someone had forecast we'd have a COVID vaccine within 18 months, it would have seemed utterly ridiculous based on past experience. The historical average time from identifying a new infectious agent to getting a licensed vaccine is something like 8 to 10 years. The previous record holder was the mumps vaccine, which took 4 years. Some experts were even projecting it might take until November 2033 to get a COVID vaccine. That shows how unprecedented the actual speed was. But the key mRNA vaccine breakthrough, the fundamental technology, actually occurred way back in 2005, with crucial work on modifying mRNA to make it stable and less inflammatory. That groundwork was essential, so when SARS-CoV-2 emerged, the platform was ready. It resulted in the first vaccine approval in history within just 1 year for a completely new pathogen. Billions of doses of mRNA COVID vaccines have since been administered globally, and this success has undeniably propelled the mRNA lipid nanoparticle vaccine platform forward as a leading approach for developing vaccines against many other infectious diseases.
What other recent vaccine successes are there, perhaps beyond COVID, that really highlight this accelerated progress?
The respiratory syncytial virus, RSV program, is another fantastic example of extraordinary progress, even using more traditional protein-based approaches alongside newer ones. RSV was identified way back in 1956. But it took 67 years to finally get an effective vaccine approved, despite RSV causing around 120,000 child deaths annually worldwide and significant hospitalizations and deaths in older adults every year. Decades of failure. Then suddenly, in 2023, results from 4 large randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials of 3 different vaccines were reported, all showing remarkable success. All were single-dose vaccines, demonstrating marked efficacy up to 94% protection against lower respiratory tract disease in people aged 60 and older, and around 82% protection for infants up to 6 months old when the vaccine was given to pregnant women in their 3rd trimester. This remarkable breakthrough finally emerged from rational, structure-based vaccine design. Scientists figured out the precise atomic structure of the key RSV protein, the fusion or F protein, in its prefusion shape, the form it takes before it infects a cell. They then engineered ways to stabilize the protein in this specific shape, including making a key 2-proline substitution, very similar to stabilization techniques used for the COVID spike protein vaccines. This stabilized perfusion protein elicited much more potent neutralizing antibodies. Furthermore, building on this structural understanding, the first single-dose monoclonal antibody, called nirsevimab, brand name Beyfortus, designed to prevent RSV disease in newborns and babies, was also FDA approved in 2023. It works by binding to that prefusion F protein, essentially blocking infection. It's a fantastic example of how basic science understanding leads to multiple effective interventions.
And hepatitis C, that's another huge global health burden, but one where we actually have a cure, yet it persists. What's the story there?
Right, the hepatitis C virus, HCV, was identified in 1989.
It causes chronic liver disease, cirrhosis, and liver cancer, killing approximately 300,000 people each year worldwide. What's truly fascinating, and perhaps tragic here, is that we've had highly effective curative antiviral pills available since 2014. These REC-acting antivirals can cure over 95% of infections with just a few weeks of treatment. Yet, of the more than 2.4 million Americans estimated to be chronically infected, a staggering 40% don't even know they have it because it's often asymptomatic for years. And about 75% of those infected progress to the chronic form if left untreated. This is why screening, especially for high-risk groups, is absolutely essential. Currently, 15 countries are actually on track to eliminate hepatitis C as a public health threat this decade, thanks to comprehensive national screening and treatment campaigns. But the United States is lagging far behind that goal. This represents a massive squandered public health opportunity, largely due to issues of cost, access to care, and lack of widespread screening implementation. It again raises that important question. Why do we sometimes fail to fully utilize proven cures when they become available, allowing a preventable and curable disease to continue causing so much suffering and death?
Thinking about the next potential pandemic, what about surveillance? How can we be better prepared to detect and track threats early?
We learned a lot from COVID. We know that many infections are spread by people who are asymptomatic, at least 30% for SARS-CoV-2, and it's over half for pathogens like polio. So relying only on tracking symptomatic people is clearly a big miss for understanding the true spread of an infectious agent. Future pandemic surveillance will likely need to incorporate more proactive and widespread monitoring. This could involve real-time individual and local risk assessment, perhaps delivered via smartphone apps, using multimodal AI that integrates various data streams that's becoming technically possible now. We're even seeing AI being used to diagnose COVID simply from the sound of a forced cough recorded on a smartphone, and potentially differentiate it from other respiratory pathogens like influenza or tuberculosis. Early results are exceeding expectations, and this could potentially improve the speed of diagnosis and reduce health inequities, especially in resource-limited settings.
If there's one standout success story for a vaccine fundamentally changing the face of a dreaded disease, it has to be the human papillomavirus, or HPV, vaccine and its impact on cervical cancer, right? What makes this so unique?
Oh, absolutely. The HPV vaccine story is remarkable and also somewhat frustrating. Nearly all cases of cervical cancer, 99.7%, are directly attributed to chronic infection with certain high-risk types of HPV. Normally, when HPV infections occur naturally, they often enter the genital mucosa stealthily, and the body only mounts a low-level antibody response, which can take over 8 months to develop and often isn't protective against future infections. However, getting 2 or 3 sequential shots of the HPV vaccine achieves something amazing. It induces extremely high levels of neutralizing antibodies, achieving what's called sterilizing immunity. This prevents the virus from even entering the cells in the first place, offering potentially lifelong protection. This is truly superhuman immunity because it completely defies the old adage that natural infection always offers better protection than vaccination. In this case, the vaccine is far superior. But here's the frustrating part. Back in the United States, the HPV vaccination rate remains alarmingly low, only around 60% completion rate among adolescents. Meanwhile, cervical cancer still kills more than 300,000 women globally each year, and worldwide, only about 1 in 5 eligible girls have received the vaccine. And it's not just cervical cancer. Head and neck cancers, particularly those involving the throat or pharyngeal cancers, are now the most common malignancy caused by HPV in many Western countries, with even higher annual case numbers than cervical cancer. The vaccine is FDA approved and highly effective at preventing these cancers too. Men clearly benefit from vaccination through marked reduction of head and neck cancers, as well as anal and penile cancers, but their uptake rates, especially for catch-up vaccination between ages 27 to 45, are even lower, less than 1/3 of women's rates. So here we have the prototypic superhuman immunity vaccine. It's exceptionally safe and effective at preventing multiple types of HPV-related cancers. Yet we face this familiar and daunting problem of inadequate population vaccination coverage that prevents us from potentially eradicating these cancers entirely. It's a public health failure we simply cannot ignore.
Can vaccines potentially prevent diseases that we've long thought were unrelated to infection? That's a fascinating concept.
Yes, potentially. The underlying principle is simple. If a specific infection is proven to be a necessary cause of a chronic disease, then a vaccine preventing that infection could, in theory, prevent the disease. For instance, the Epstein-Barr virus, EBV, the virus that causes mono, was actually the first virus shown to induce cancer, specifically Burkitt's lymphoma, over 60 years ago. Now, about 95% of the world's population carries a lifelong, usually asymptomatic EBV infection. So clearly, the virus alone isn't sufficient to cause cancer. An additional factor, like a specific chromosome rearrangement for lymphoma or an epigenetic event for nasopharyngeal carcinoma, seems required. Less is known about its link to stomach cancer. But given that EBV is estimated to be involved in about 1.5% of all cancers globally, developing an effective EBV vaccine could potentially be transformative for preventing those specific malignancies. Research is ongoing, but it's a challenging target.
What about sepsis? That's the third leading cause of death in U.S. hospitals, an extreme reaction to infection. How are we doing in tackling that?
Sepsis is a massive global problem. It's an extreme, dysregulated immune reaction to an infection that can lead to organ failure and death. It kills nearly 50 million people globally each year, often because the diagnosis is missed or delayed, or the initial care is suboptimal. AI is starting to make inroads here. An AI tool designed to predict sepsis risk, which was widely adopted by many hospitals, initially performed poorly in real-world settings due to something called dataset shift. The data it was trained on didn't perfectly match the patients it was being used on. However, improvements made to these AI models since around 2021 have shown they can significantly reduce the time it takes to start antibiotics, and were associated with an 18% reduction in deaths when physicians responded promptly to the AI alerts. And just in 2024, the FDA approved the first AI model specifically for sepsis prediction, called Prisnosis, which uses 22 different clinical and laboratory parameters to assess risk. This marks a significant step forward in using AI for early detection and intervention in critical care.
And pulling back again, what's truly striking here is reflecting on how far we've come in our technical ability to diagnose infections, yet sometimes these powerful tools aren't fully utilized. Sharon Peacock, a leading professor of microbiology, wrote way back in 2014 that microbial sequencing should be done as close to the patient as possible. Unquote. More than a decade later, despite remarkable advances that have made sequencing incredibly low cost and rapid, this approach known as clinical metagenomics is still only routinely done in a handful of advanced hospitals globally.
Why is metagenomics not more widespread then? It sounds incredibly useful and much faster than traditional methods like blood cultures.
It is truly transformative for diagnosing infections, especially challenging ones. Metagenomics offers an unbiased, direct way to identify almost any pathogen bacteria, viruses, fungi, or parasites directly from a patient sample like blood or spinal fluid, often within hours. And importantly, it can often tell us about the pathogen's antibiotic resistance genes at the same time, guiding appropriate treatment much faster than waiting for cultures. As you said, it's been technically feasible since at least 2014, when it famously saved a 14-year-old boy's life by diagnosing a rare brain infection, neuroleptospirosis, that traditional tests had missed. But despite that potential, it's largely been, as the source puts it, collecting dust in terms of widespread clinical adoption. Recent reports continue to show its power. At UCSF, it provided highly accurate diagnoses for patients with infections of unknown origin in less than 6 hours using rapid nanopore sequencing. In London, it successfully made diagnoses in 92% of challenging ICU patients within 8 hours. In Shanghai, a study showed metagenomics diagnosed 65 patients compared to only 13 diagnosed by traditional blood cultures in the same group. Many cases that were culture negative were positively diagnosed with metagenomics. This technology really is game-changing for infection diagnosis, but its adoption is still surprisingly limited, likely due to factors like cost, though decreasing, need for bioinformatics expertise, and perhaps just inertia within established medical laboratory practices. The journey ahead, modulating aging and future expectations.
Okay, let's turn to the ultimate question. Aging itself. There's always this fierce debate about the upper limit of human lifespan. What's the latest scientific understanding of the aging process at its core?
Right, the maximum lifespan debate. Some researchers point to mathematical models like the Gompertz-Makeham law, which suggest death risk increases exponentially with age after maturity. Others invoke the Hayflick limit theory, the idea that normal human cells can only divide a finite number of times, maybe around 50, before they stop. And observationally, Gene Kalman, who died at 122 back in 1997, remains the oldest documented person, and that record hasn't really been convincingly broken since. Beyond the biology, there's also the basic physics of wear and tear, the cumulative damage and decay that occurs over time, from recurrent stress to our cells, tissues, and the whole body. You could call it the obligatory decay attributed to the second law of thermodynamics. But whether there's an absolute fixed biological limit is almost a moot point for practical purposes. What we ideally want to do is extend the healthy life years at the health span. We want to achieve full alignment between healthy adjusted life expectancy, HALE, and total life expectancy, LA.
And achieving that ultimately depends not on just hoping to break longevity records, but on actively exploiting the science of aging to keep us healthier for longer.
So how do scientists actually define this aging process in more detail? You mentioned these biological hallmarks of aging. What are they?
Yes, the hallmarks provide a useful framework. The process of aging is generally considered to be the gradual accumulation of various forms of molecular and cellular damage over time. Scientists have identified a set of these biological hallmarks of aging. These are processes that generally meet three criteria. They occur during normal aging. Experimentally exaggerating them tends to accelerate aging, and experimentally ameliorating them tends to slow down the normal aging process and increase healthy lifespan, at least in model organisms. The most widely cited paper outlining these hallmarks was updated in 2023, expanding the original list from 9 to 12 distinct but interconnected hallmarks. The recent additions include chronic inflammation, sometimes called inflammaging, dysbiosis, imbalances in the gut microbiome, and disabled macroautophagy, impaired cellular waste removal. This reflects a growing, more holistic understanding of aging. Now, while breaking aging down into these distinct hallmarks is perhaps a bit arbitrary and reductionist because there's considerable overlap and crosstalk between them, they're all fundamentally integrative processes that contribute collectively to the decline we associate with aging.
Okay, can you give us some examples of these hallmarks, maybe focusing on a few key ones and their implications for how our bodies actually age?
Sure. The hallmarks are often grouped into categories. The primary hallmarks are thought to be the initial triggers of damage. These include genomic instability, meaning an accumulation of DNA damage and mutations over time, telomere attrition, the shortening of the protective caps at the ends of our chromosomes with each cell division, epigenetic alterations, changes in how our genes are switched on or off without changing the DNA sequence itself, and loss of proteostasis, a decline in the cell's ability to properly fold, maintain, and degrade proteins. Then there are antagonistic hallmarks, which are often responses to that initial damage, but can become harmful themselves when dysregulated. These include deregulated nutrient sensing, like the insulin IGF-1 pathway becoming less responsive, mitochondrial dysfunction, our cellular powerhouses becoming less efficient and producing more damaging byproducts, and cellular senescence, those zombie cells we talked about, which stop dividing but remain metabolically active and secrete a cocktail of harmful inflammatory factors. Finally, there are the integrative hallmarks, which are the ultimate culprits responsible for the functional decline of aging. These include stem cell exhaustion, our pools of regenerative stem cells becoming depleted or less functional as we age; altered intercellular communication, meaning the signaling between cells, both locally and systemically, becomes less coordinated and more pro-inflammatory; chronic inflammation, that low-grade, persistent inflammation; and dysbiosis, unfavorable shifts in the composition and function of our gut microbiome. Understanding these hallmarks is crucial because they provide specific targets. If we can develop interventions that counteract or mitigate these processes, we might be able to directly modulate the aging process itself.
So how might we actually influence this aging process then? The material divides potential interventions into lifestyle approaches and pharmacologic approaches. Let's start with lifestyle, which we've already seen is incredibly powerful for disease prevention. Does it impact these aging hallmarks directly?
Yes, lifestyle seems to have a direct impact. Some studies specifically look at the overall effect of a healthy lifestyle, combining diet, physical activity, sleep, etc., on biological aging markers or lifespan, teasing out the genetic component. In that large UK Biobank cohort, again, over 350,000 participants followed for more than 10 years, researchers used a polygenic risk score for lifespan to estimate the genetic contribution. They found that genetics appear to contribute maybe about 20% to lifespan variation, but having a favorable lifestyle had a strong, independent, and pronounced positive effect. Importantly, a healthy lifestyle significantly mitigated the genetic risk of having a shorter lifespan and added about 5 years of life expectancy on average, independent of genetic background. In a smaller combined study of over 11,000 individuals from 4 different cohorts, but with a much longer follow-up of 28 years, they looked at metabolic signatures. A healthy lifestyle metabolomic signature, primarily reflecting healthy lipid metabolism, aligned with having a low BMI and eating a healthy diet, was associated with a 25% increased likelihood of achieving longevity, defined as reaching age 85 or older. It was also linked to a significantly lower risk of all-cause mortality, as well as deaths from cardiovascular disease and cancer. It's important to note, however, that both of these reports predominantly featured participants of white European ancestry, which limits how broadly we can extrapolate the specific numbers.
You mentioned earlier that exercise seems uniquely powerful, maybe even resetting biological age. How does it tie into these hallmarks?
Right. What's fascinating here, and quite unique, is that exercise appears to be the only lifestyle intervention that has been well validated, at least in some studies, to actually reset or reverse certain measures of biological age in humans. Some of its widespread health benefits, its salutary effects, can likely be attributed to exerkines. These are a multitude of beneficial molecules, proteins, metabolites, RNA fragments that are released into the bloodstream by muscles and other tissues during and after physical activity. While some of these exerkines act to tone down chronic inflammation, like interleukin-10, others, like interleukin-6, can actually increase acutely with high-intensity and long-duration exercise. This might seem counterintuitive, but it likely simulates a temporary stress response, which acts as a form of adaptive preconditioning, making cells more resilient over time. As a concrete example, one study found that just 1 hour of combined aerobic and strength exercise in patients with pancreatic cancer led to a significant jump in their bloodstream levels of CD8 plus cytotoxic T cells, the immune system's cancer fighters, and actually doubled the survival time of these specific immune cells in vitro, suggesting exercise could directly help the immune system fight the cancer. There's a big NIH initiative called the Molecular Transducers of Physical Activity Consortium, MOTPAC, launched in 2016, aimed at mapping all these molecular changes induced by exercise. Early results from animal models, like treadmill training in rats, showed exercise led to better mitochondrial function, less inflammation, likely reduction of autoimmune diseases, and protection from fatty liver disease. And in a separate experimental study in mice, exercise even seemed to achieve rejuvenation of aged skeletal muscle stem cells, restoring their regenerative capacity.
Are there other lifestyle factors that have been shown to influence aging markers or biological age?
Yes, definitely. We're learning more about these connections. For instance, early life exposure to tobacco smoke, whether as a fetus exposed during pregnancy or during childhood, has been clearly linked to accelerated epigenetic aging later in life, meaning unfavorable changes in gene expression patterns associated with aging. Even the physiological stress resulting from major surgery has been shown to transiently increase measures of epigenetic aging. And chronic social stress, like loneliness or discrimination, seems to facilitate immune aging, impairing immune function over time. It shows how various life events and exposures can leave a mark on our biological age.
Okay, moving to pharmacologic interventions using drugs or supplements to target aging. How are scientists trying to, say, reverse the aging of our immune system?
This is a very active area of research. The source describes 3 very different approaches that have been assessed, with varying degrees of success or evidence. One small early-stage trial, called the TREAM trial, tested a combination of recombinant human growth hormone, HGH, metformin, the diabetes drug, and DHEA, a steroid precursor, in a small group of just 10 healthy male participants aged 50 to 65. Of these, only growth hormone has a known effect on potentially rejuvenating the thymus gland, which is vital for producing new T cells and tends to shrink with age. Intriguingly, MRI scans revealed evidence of thymus regeneration in these men after the treatment. This was accompanied by a decrease in multiple inflammatory markers and signs of a heightened immune response. Furthermore, their epigenetic age, measured by several different aging clocks, like the Horvath and Grimmage clocks, dropped by a mean of about 1.5 years over the treatment period, with some evidence of further reduction at a 1-year follow-up. However, it's crucial to put this in context. While growth hormone supplementation is known to improve muscle mass and bone density in some older adults, it also promotes insulin resistance, which is generally unfavorable, and there are absolutely no data from large trials to support a beneficial impact of HGH on overall lifespan or health span. So this approach remains highly experimental and carries risks.
What about those young plasma transfusions? That sounded quite controversial. Is there any science behind that?
Yeah, that's generated a lot of hype, but the science is essentially non-existent in humans. Despite a complete lack of proven efficacy or safety data in people, various companies and clinics have been marketing infusions of plasma derived from young donors, or procedures like plasmapheresis, which removes and replaces plasma, claiming they have anti-aging effects. One company, Ambrosia, was famously offering plasma from young donors for $8,000 a liter. This led the FDA to issue a specific warning back in 2019, stating that some patients are being preyed upon by unscrupulous actors promoting these unproven treatments. Unfortunately, despite this warning, some clinics apparently still offer these types of services, capitalizing on the hope for rejuvenation despite the high expense, the lack of any credible evidence for benefit, and the significant potential hazards associated with plasma infusions and plasmapheresis procedures. It's a clear case of hype outpacing science.
But fecal microbial transplants showed some promise, at least in the mouse studies you mentioned earlier.
Yes, that's a more scientifically grounded area, though still mostly preclinical. The apparent rejuvenation benefits seen in parabiosis experiments, where old and young mice share a circulatory system, seem to extend beyond just factors in the blood or cerebrospinal fluid. Studies found that transplanting fecal matter from young mice into old mice, essentially transferring the gut microbiome, led to improvements in gut health, eye function, and even brain function, like cognition, in the aged recipient mice. Conversely, transplanting the microbiome from old mice into young mice seemed to accelerate some aspects of aging in the young recipients. This strongly suggests that the composition and function of the gut microbiome plays a significant role in systemic aging, making it a very interesting therapeutic target.
What about directly targeting those zombie senescent cells? That sounded like a very direct way to tackle a hallmark of aging. How is that progressing?
Yes. Targeting cellular senescence is definitely one of the most promising and actively pursued strategies in aging biology right now. Back in 2015, researchers, including colleagues at Scripps Research and the Mayo Clinic, published a seminal paper showing how a combination of drinks, termed senolytics, could selectively kill these senescent cells in mice. Since then, there's been abundant evidence showing various health benefits from this intervention in numerous animal models of aging and age-related diseases. First-generation senolytic drugs include repurposed drugs like dasatinib, a tyrosine kinase inhibitor approved for treating leukemia, combined with naturally occurring flavonoid plant metabolites like quercetin, found in onions and apples, or fisetin, found in strawberries. Since senescent cells are notoriously resistant to undergoing programmed cell death, apoptosis, another group of drugs being tested as senolytics are BCL2 inhibitors, like nefitoclax, which promote apoptosis. Now, second-generation approaches are emerging. These include things like engineered CAR T cells designed to specifically hunt down and kill senescent cells, or using drugs or nanoparticle approaches to enhance the body's natural waste disposal mechanisms, autophagy, to clear out senescent cells more effectively. Unlike the young blood story, there are now many ongoing early-phase clinical trials testing senolytics in humans, mostly using those first-generation compounds, like dasatinib plus quercetin or fisetin, often in combination. They're being tested for conditions thought to be driven by senescent cell accumulation, like idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, chronic kidney disease, Alzheimer's disease, osteoarthritis, sepsis, frailty, and diabetic macular edema. Early small trials have provided some proof of concept, indicating they can clear senescent cells in humans, e.g. in a diabetic kidney disease and pulmonary fibrosis. But importantly, they have so far failed to provide clear clinical benefit in other conditions like knee osteoarthritis or improving bone metabolism in postmenopausal women in initial trials. So the translation from mice to human clinical benefit is still proving challenging.
And what about well-known drugs like rapamycin or the widely used diabetes drug metformin? Are they living up to their anti-aging hype?
Rapamycin, and its derivatives called rapalogs, is certainly one of the most promising candidates based on animal studies. It inhibits a key nutrient-sensing pathway called mTOR, and similar to caloric restriction, it consistently extends lifespan and health span in diverse species, from yeast to mice. It's currently being tested in dogs at a reasonable scale in the Dog Aging Project, an ambitious NIH-funded initiative looking for ways to extend healthy canine lifespan, which could provide valuable insights for humans. Rapamycin appears capable of favorably modulating many, if not all, of the 12 hallmarks of aging. However, despite the strong preclinical data, there are currently no large-scale human studies demonstrating that rapamycin actually extends human lifespan or health span. So its use for anti-aging in humans remains purely experimental. Metformin is another interesting case. It's a very common, safe, and inexpensive drug for type 2 diabetes, and observational studies suggested it might reduce mortality even beyond its effects on blood sugar. It activates AMPK, often called the guardian of metabolism, which has links to longevity pathways. There are clinical trials underway testing metformin specifically for healthy aging in non-diabetics, like the TAME trial targeting aging with metformin. But progress has been slow, partly due to funding challenges. As of now, despite the suggestive data, there is no compelling evidence from randomized trials proving anti-aging effects from metformin in non-diabetic humans yet. and NAD plus precursor supplements like NMN, nicotinamide mononucleotide, and NR, nicotinamide riboside, which are incredibly popular globally. While NAD plus levels do decline with age and restoring them improves health in aged mice, the source is quite clear. There's currently no clear evidence of benefit from these supplements in rigorous human trials, and there are even some potential safety concerns emerging that need further investigation.
What about the GLP-1 drugs we discussed extensively earlier? Could they have broader anti-aging effects beyond weight loss and diabetes?
That's a very pertinent question right now. The GLP-1 receptor agonists have been shown in some studies to improve various biological aging clocks and, as we noted, significantly reduce markers of inflammation like hsCRP. Given that chronic inflammation is a key hallmark of aging, this is certainly suggestive of potential broader health span benefits. Other promising pharmacological avenues being explored include developing new classes of anti-inflammatory drugs, like CGS sting blockers or TNIC inhibitors, which are now in clinical trials. Hormone replacement therapies like estrogen or testosterone are sometimes considered, but these generally carry serious potential risks, including increased cancer risk, that often outweigh potential anti-aging benefits in healthy individuals. Interestingly, one rather exotic experiment involved transplanting ovaries from young mice into old female mice, which actually increased the lifespan of the transplant recipients, highlighting the profound role of endocrine signaling in aging. Looking ahead, the future likely holds promise for developing entirely new ways to manipulate other hallmarks of aging, like improving intercellular communication, enhancing waste removal pathways, autophagy, precisely tuning the epigenome, or rejuvenating stem cell pools. These are all very active areas of research.
Wow. What an incredible, comprehensive deep dive that was. We've journeyed all the way from the intricate world of our cells and the foundational power of genomics and AI, through the daily impacts of our diet and environmental toxins, and right into the cutting edge of drug treatments, cancer therapies, brain health, autoimmune diseases, and the latest in vaccine science.
We really have. It truly highlights how the current historic convergence of breakthroughs in medical science is perhaps broader and deeper than is easy to grasp all at once. There's just so much coming into view right now that has the genuine potential to truly transform human health and longevity.
And the material concludes with a really powerful forward-looking statement. Despite all the challenges and the hype, the underlying belief is that we will ultimately see effective ways to achieve body-wide modulation of the aging process itself. As it says, there are many promising shots on goal right now, huge resources being expended globally, and a dramatic acceleration of drug discovery efforts, significantly boosted by AI.
Exactly. And what's particularly fascinating here is that parallel drawn again with the GLP-1 drugs. Despite decades of really blatant failures and disappointments in developing effective obesity treatments, it was ultimately possible to tackle one of the most profound and complex medical challenges of our time. And the source suggests it would not be at all surprising if a derivative of that very same drug class, maybe modified or combined with other agents, eventually pays dividends for extending health span more broadly. Now, that's likely in the cards for the future, not something proven for right now, but the underlying scientific momentum and the proof of principle are undeniable.
So the real excitement here isn't just about potentially extending lifespan, adding more years, but really about extending healthy lifespan, adding more healthy, functional, vibrant years. That's the core message, isn't it?
Precisely. That's where the excitement is well-founded and potentially near-term, because we are definitely going to see major progress in the prevention of many common age-related diseases and in preserving organ-specific health for much longer. We know that most major age-related diseases, heart disease, many cancers, dementia, type 2 diabetes, have a long, slow warm-up period, often at least 1 to 2 decades before any symptoms manifest. And now with the combination of sensitive biomarkers, polygenic risk scores, proteomics, full genome sequencing, advanced imaging techniques, wearables, and sophisticated multimodal AI to integrate it all, we are gaining truly unprecedented power to identify an individual's high-risk status for specific conditions. And not just identify high risk, but potentially do so much earlier in a person's life, and maybe even predict the timing of when a condition is likely to begin to manifest if interventions aren't made. AI, in particular, appears to be capable of reliably predicting critical tipping points just before they happen in various complex systems, and the human body surely qualifies as perhaps the most complex system we know.
Which really brings us to a final important question for everyone listening. If we gain this power to predict so much about our future health so early on, what responsibility do we each have to act on that knowledge, to actively shape our own healthy future?
And taking that one step further, what does this imply for future generations? For our children and grandchildren who may have access to these predictive insights and preventive interventions right from birth, how might that fundamentally alter their health trajectories and society itself in ways we can only just begin to imagine?
A lot to think about indeed. That's all for this deep dive. We hope you feel more informed, perhaps a bit more empowered, and definitely intrigued by the rapidly evolving science of longevity. Until next time, keep digging, keep learning, and keep thriving.